You have, in all likelihood, eaten a meal that did not require you to risk your life, and you are existing in a pocket of manufactured safety, a small bubble of warmth and light carved out of the indifferent dark. And into that bubble, I am going to bring the cold. I am going to tell you a story, because that is what we do. We sit in our warmth and we listen to tales of the frost, perhaps to feel better about our own lives, or perhaps to remember something we have, as a species, collectively and perhaps foolishly forgotten. Tonight's story isn't about kings or queens. It's not about the grand tapestry of politics, the rise and fall of empires, or the delicate philosophies debated in marble halls. No, the philosophy we're discussing tonight was carved into frozen mud and written in blood on the snow. Those half-wild trappers and wanderers who lived in the frozen heart of North America long before central heating or good decisions existed. Let's break that down. Let's pull that entire concept apart and see what's inside, because every word in that sentence is doing a tremendous amount of heavy lifting. Half-wild. This, to me, is the most important part. Not fully wild. That's a different thing. A wolf is wild. A bear is wild. They are complete. You are, in essence, entirely alone, wedged between the rock of your past and the hard, frozen place you've chosen as your future. And what did this half-wild man do? He was a trapper and wanderer. Again, a contradiction. The two words are at war with each other. The trapper is a businessman. He is an agent of commerce. He is the long, bloody arm of the global market, reaching into the pristine wilderness to rip the fur from its back. He is there for one reason: money. He was a man who went into the deep, profound silence of the continent specifically to do the loud, violent work of killing things for money. He was a man who hated society so much that he spent his life gathering the one thing that would allow him to briefly, violently, return to it at the summer rendezvous to drink and fight and spend. He was a man at war with himself, and he chose a landscape that perfectly mirrored that internal war. The heart of a thing is its essence, and the essence of this land was cold. It was a place of absolutes, white and black, life and death, warmth and oblivion. There was no gray area. There was no mild. There was no comfortable. This frozen heart was a place that tested you. It didn't care about your morals, your beliefs, your name, or your past. It cared about one thing: your competence. The absence of central heating is not just an inconvenience. It's a different state of being. It means you are never, ever safe. It means the void is not just outside your window, it's in the room with you, and you are in a constant, active physical struggle to keep it from wrapping its arms around you. And then, the second part of that phrase, the glorious, cynical, perfect part, or good decisions existed. This is the key to the whole story. The very idea of a good decision would have been laughable to them. They were not adventurers choosing a new life. They were, almost to a man, refugees. They were refugees from civilization. They were failed farmers, whose good decision was to starve on a patch of bad land. They were restless veterans, whose good decision was to rot in a city they no longer recognized. They were men who had run out of people willing to tolerate them, whose good decision was to be locked in a cage. It's the nod of acknowledgement that says, yes, I am here. I am watching. Continue. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. This is not a transaction of pity. This is not a tax. This is a pact. I'm not here to beg for algorithms. I'm here to tell stories. The real ones. The ones with the dirt and the frost and the uncomfortable truths. If you are here for that, if you are here for the genuine article, if you too are tired of the polite, civilized lies and want the brutal, honest truth of the wilderness, then we are on the same page. Your like, your subscribe, is a handshake in the dark. It's a signal that says, I'm in. Show me the cold. And one last thing before we truly begin. Before we leave the safety of this shore and push our canoe into that frozen river, we are a community of thousands, separated by oceans and time zones, yet connected instantly by this single, invisible thread. We have built a global village on the very technology that has conquered the distance, the cold, and the isolation that define their entire existence. We are all of us, right now, together, huddled around this digital campfire. We are the exact polar opposite of the mountain man. We are connected, we are warm, and we are safe. So let's honor that. They were, almost to a man, failures. They were the grit in the gears of the American experiment. They were the men who didn't fit. They were the men who lost. They were just the kind of people who saw the edge of the map and thought, let's see what's past that terrible idea. This isn't the logic of a brave man. It's not the reasoned calculation of an explorer. This is the logic of a man standing in the smoldering ruins of his life, with nothing left to lose. It's the logic of a man who has burned every bridge and has only one direction left to walk away. It is the grand existential hold, my beer, of a man who has failed so completely at safe that suicidal starts to look like a viable career move. Most were failed farmers. Let's think about that. In the 19th century, the farm was the American dream. It was the covenant. God and Thomas Jefferson had decreed that to own and work the land was to be virtuous. The chatter of a town meeting, the judgment of a preacher, the endless, grinding smallness of it all. Civilization was too noisy, too structured, too judgmental. The rules were too many and too stupid. After you've lived in a world where the only rule is don't die, the rule thou shalt not be drunk on a Tuesday feels constricting. They were men addicted to the immediacy of a world without bureaucracy. They wandered west during the early 1800s, lured by the fur trade and the promise of riches. But let's be clear about riches. Riches, for them, mostly meant not starving to death while chasing beavers through waist-deep snow. The promise was a lie, they told themselves. The lure was the fur, the beaver pelt, the hairy banknotes that a man in London would eventually wear as a hat. They were the bottom-rung, frontline, expendable grunts in the first great wave of global capitalism. We need to be the main character in our own story. We need the universe to be about us. The cold annihilates this fantasy. It is the great, terrifying, and ultimately liberating truth. It is the physical manifestation of the universe's complete and total indifference to your existence. You are a small, fragile bag of 98.6-degree water. You are a biological furnace, burning calories to maintain a very specific, very narrow temperature range. The world you have just entered is -20 or -30, and the cold will, patiently, and without malice, correct this imbalance. You can scream at the wind all night if you like. The wind, as the man said, has better things to do. It was here before you, and it will be here long after it has scoured your bones clean. This is a profound and terrifying psychological shift. The civilized man is always looking for a way to beat things. City people today talk about beating the weather by wearing heated jackets or moving to Florida. It would just seep in, a small, creeping numbness. A mistake made at 10 a.m. when the sun was high and you felt cocky. That mistake becomes a regret at 2 p.m. when the light starts to fail. It becomes a crisis at 4 p.m. when you can no longer feel your fingers well enough to work your flint. And it becomes a corpse at 8 p.m. when the wolves find your frozen, still body. This was the lens through which they saw the world, and it's how they judged the new arrivals. It's the cold, hard, logical endpoint of a life lived at the mercy of physics. This is what separated them from us. We think the cold is an inconvenience. They knew it was a law of nature. They didn't fight it. They didn't curse it. Not for long, anyway. They adapted until even the frost couldn't tell if they were alive or part of the landscape. This is the end state. This is enlightenment, mountain man style. You don't conquer the cold. You join it. Those who didn't listen, those who didn't learn the language of the silence, became headlines in someone else's cautionary tale. They became the frozen, grinning corpse that the next man found in the spring, a silent, mummified testament to the sin of not paying attention. The survivors, the veterans, they became scholars. They were masters of a dead language that was still being spoken. Every mountain man knew how to interpret snow like scripture. This wasn't poetry. This was work. This was adaptation. When you live outside 24/7 for years, your body remembers. It rewilds. Your senses, long dulled by the civilized world of walls and roofs, come roaring back to life. You become the barometer. You become the thermometer. Modern people open a weather app. The mountain men were a weather app. They didn't wonder. They observed. A shift in the wind meant a storm was planning something personal. The wind knew. The mountain man's only job was to be humble enough to listen. You learned to listen to everything. Trees, birds, your own shivering heartbeat. Modern civilization calls it intuition. The mountain men called it paying attention. Intuition is a soft word. It's a mystical word. It implies a gift. Paying attention is a hard word. It's work. It is a full-time, high-stakes, life-or-death job. It is a constant, grinding, moment-to-moment act of focus. You didn't pay attention because you were spiritual. You paid attention because the penalty for not paying attention was a 3-day-old corpse. They didn't survive because they were tougher. They survived because they noticed. The wilderness, it turned out, was not a chaos. It was an order. A very, very strict order. It had rules. It had a language. And it was, in its own way, fair. The wilderness was generous to those who respected it and brutal to everyone else. It didn't care about the color of your skin, the god you prayed to, or the money you had. It cared only about your competence. It was the last true meritocracy. You can't learn that kind of awareness from a podcast. This is the punchline, isn't it? This is the cynical, uncomfortable truth that connects their world to ours. We sit in our warm, safe rooms, listening to this, and we think we understand. We think, I could do that. I have grit. No, slowly, quietly, and always with frost on their beards. The currency of heat. For a mountain man, heat wasn't comfort. It was currency. This is the next great philosophical divide. For us, comfort is the goal. We work our jobs, we build our homes, we arrange our lives, all in the pursuit of comfort. Comfort is the point. For the mountain man, comfort was a fantasy. It was a civilized word. It was a rumor. It didn't exist in his world. There was only survival. You must, or you will die. Your hands are numb. They are not hands. They are frozen claws. They are stupid, useless meat hooks. You can't feel the flint. You can't feel the steel. They carried tinder like treasure. Scraps of bark, dry moss, bits of cloth that hadn't yet frozen into iron. This was their bank account. They carried it inside their clothes, against their own skin, hoping their own meager body heat could protect it from the all-consuming damp of the world. They knew exactly how long a single log would burn, how fast snow could drown a flame, and how many curses it took before smoke turned into fire. On average, 7. You strike the flint, a spark, it dies. You strike again, a spark, it dies. The wind howls, it's laughing at you. Is that all you have? You huddle your body over your tiny, pathetic pile of tinder, trying to create a shelter with your own dying warmth. You strike again and again. Your frozen claws are clumsy. You drop the steel. You curse. You weep. But the tears freeze to your eyelashes. You find the steel. You strike. A spark. It catches. A tiny, tiny wisp of smoke. Now the real work begins. You don't breathe on it. You whisper to it. You offer it the most gentle, most controlled, most loving breath you have ever taken. You are a priest, begging a god to be born. Please, 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 the smoke grows. A tiny pinprick of orange. And for them, that was enough. You could smell last night's fire, smoke. You could smell last week's dinner, animal grease. You could smell 2 months ago's fear, sweat. You could track a mountain man long before you saw him. Wolves did. Usually, they chose to go in the other direction. This was their insulation. It was heavy. It was dirty. It was honest. Their coats were heavy, their hats ridiculous, and their boots permanently damp. Damp, not wet. Wet was fatal. Damp was just life. You're not worried about the future. You're worried about the fact that your left boot is leaking. The misery was the cure for the madness. Modern people talk about winter fashion. Mountain men talked about not dying. They didn't wear designer jackets. They wore whatever hadn't been eaten yet. Their philosophy was simple. Is it warm? Does it stop the wind? Then I will wear it. And in that moment, in that first warm spring breeze, they felt the civilized man return. The man who could feel things. The man who could regret. And yet, as soon as the next winter came, they did it all again. Because survival wasn't comfortable. It was addictive. It was the only high that mattered. It was the only truth they knew. But because it was, quite literally, a lump of pure fat. It was the high-test fuel. It was the jet fuel of the wilderness. Eating a beaver tail was like swallowing a log for your internal furnace. Elk tongue was a luxury. The rest of the animal was just fuel with fur attached. If it had fat, it was gold. If it didn't, it was a lesson. The lesson was rabbit starvation. You could eat rabbit all day, every day, and you would starve to death. Why? No fat. It's too lean. This wasn't spirituality. This was efficiency. Bones for broth. To get the last bit of fat, the marrow. Hides for shelter, the insulation. Sinew for sewing, to repair the insulation. And the smell for keeping neighbors away. Salt was worth its weight in gold. Why? Because salt preserves. Salt civilizes the meat. It stops the decay. You didn't season food to make it taste better. You seasoned it to make it exist longer. The only spice blend they had was desperation mixed with soot. When supplies ran out, creativity took over. And creativity is a very polite word for horror. They ate their horses. A tool one day, fuel the next. Their belts, boiled leather. And once, in truly dire times, the boiled soles of their boots. They called it leather soup. They probably called it other things too. But language tends to break down when you're chewing footwear. There was no farm-to-table movement. The fading myth. And so they lived. For a flicker. For a brief, glorious, terrible moment in history. The age of the mountain man, this pure, unfiltered, high-stakes experiment in survival lasted, really, only about 30 years. From the 1,810 seconds to the 1,840 seconds. It wasn't a sustainable life. It was a burnout. You couldn't do this for 50 years. The cold, the hunger, the loneliness, it was a young man's game. And it was a game that most men lost. By the mid-1800s, the age of the mountain men started melting away like the snow they'd lived under for decades. Why? 2 reasons. 1, fashion. 2, civilization. The fur trade collapsed. Someone in London or Paris or New York decided that silk hats were the new fashion, not beaver. And just like that, it was over. The hairy banknote that had funded this entire insane lifestyle was worthless. The currency that had paid for the frostbite, the hunger, the leather soup, and so were the men who'd built their lives inside it. They didn't die all at once. They faded. This, perhaps, was the greatest tragedy of all. They didn't die in battle with the cold. They just became obsolete. Some became guides for settlers, muttering warnings nobody listened to. Can you imagine the hell of this? You, a man who speaks the language of the snow, who reads the wind, reduced to guiding a wagon train of failed farmers from the east, who curse the snow, who complain about the cold, who think a wool coat is enough. You tell them, don't cross that river, it's too high, and they argue with you. They vote on it. You tell them, we must stop here. The snow smells wrong, and they complain that they want to make better time. It was the ultimate, final, agonizing hell. It was civilization's final victory. It tamed them, it hired them, and this time they didn't come back. They joined the cold, finally, and for good. The world moved on. Warmth became easy. Comfort became normal. And survival became something you did accidentally. Us. He's talking about us. The same mountains that once tested men now hosted vacation lodges. The people sitting by those fireplaces never realized they were staring at the ghost of a harder world. A world that demanded you earn every degree of heat. That was a sin. That was a curse. A good cook was half magician. She, and it was almost always a she in the peasant home, had to coax life from ingredients that were often questionable at best. Bread was sometimes stretched with sawdust, not for flavor but for bulk. It was a fraud you committed against your own stomach to trick it into feeling full. Ale was thick enough to chew. It wasn't a drink. It was liquid bread. It was calories, and it was safer than the water, which was full of other kinds of chemistry, mostly fecal. And meat, when you could afford it, had to be smoked or salted to keep the worms at bay. This was the magic. It was a war against the other great indifferent force, decay. In the mountains, the cold was the enemy. Here, in the civilized world, the enemy was rot. It was the invisible world of bacteria and mold and time. You went to the field. You came back at noon. It was warm. You ate it. You went back to the field. While you were gone, you sent your child out to find food. And the food the child found was whatever grew that the animals hadn't eaten. Vegetables like leeks, onions, and cabbage grew in kitchen gardens, while herbs such as parsley, sage, and thyme lent flavor to otherwise monotonous fare. The child comes back with a handful of weeds, herbs, and an onion. The art of swan roasting was this. 1. You kill the swan, a crime for a peasant, a privilege for a lord. 2. You carefully skin it. You peel the entire skin and feather robe off the bird in one piece. 3. You roast the now naked bird. 4. You then sew the cooked bird back inside its raw feathered skin. 5. You parade this monstrosity out into the great hall. It is a taxidermied, cooked trophy. Honey, the medieval sweetener of choice, doubled as medicine and preservative, proof that nature's pantry could heal as well as feed. In the medieval kitchen, ingredients weren't merely tools of sustenance. They were social currency, tokens of faith, and symbols of fortune. A whole worldview boiled down into whatever fit in your pot. A dazzling white luxury from the East. Nobles didn't just sweeten desserts. They added sugar to meats, fish, and sauces. The idea of a savory dish just didn't exist for them. Everything was sweet and spicy and sour, all at once. A roast might be glazed with honey and dusted with cinnamon, while wine could be boiled with cloves and served steaming to guests as a sign of opulence. The result was a taste world that blurred the line between savory and sweet, which was arguably worse. Medieval cooks didn't measure in teaspoons or grams. They measured in instinct, in a good handful, a little while, or until it smells right. And since every fire burned differently and every pot had its own quirks, two cooks could make the same dish and end up with entirely different results. One delicious, one potentially fatal. The noble kitchen was not a calm place. The kitchen of a noble household was a living machine powered by people. It was a factory. There were spit boys, often young and unlucky, whose entire job was to sit beside the fire for hours, turning meat until it roasted evenly. This was a job, your career. You are spit boy. You sat next to the hellfire for 10 hours. You turned a pig. You got burned by sparks. You got blinded by smoke. And if you got lazy, if you stopped turning, the master cook would beat you. It was a miserable existence. Fish, which lives in cold water, was cold and moist. Phlegm. If you ate only fish, you would get too much phlegm. You would become phlegmatic, lazy, slow. So, you must balance it. Perhaps a dash of ginger or a splash of wine. Ginger, which grows in the hot sun, was hot and dry. Wine, which ferments and makes you feel warm, was hot and moist. You poach the cold fish in hot wine and ginger, and you have created a balanced medicine. A good cook's reputation was everything, and one spoiled dish could mean demotion, or worse, a beating from an impatient lord. Yet, when it worked, medieval cooking could be glorious. Pies stuffed with quail and almonds, sauces thickened with bread and wine, pastries filled with figs and honey, all made from scratch by firelight. It was dirty, exhausting, and often dangerous, but also deeply creative. In the medieval kitchen, chaos was an ingredient, and mastery meant taming it just long enough to serve something fit for both body and spirit. The rules of faith. And if the humors were the science of the kitchen, the church was the CEO. The church was the board of directors. The church signed the paychecks in salvation or damnation. To truly understand medieval cooking, you have to see the contrast between the feast and the famine. But this famine wasn't accidental. It wasn't drought. It was scheduled. It was mandated by God, or at least his spokesman on earth. It was a moral act governed by the church. Every bite had a place in the great spiritual calendar. What you ate and when you ate it could determine whether you were pious or gluttonous, blessed or damned. The medieval year was divided not just by seasons but by fasts and feasts. And the fast days outnumbered the feast days by a lot. Lent alone, 40 days of fasting before Easter, forbade the consumption of meat, dairy, and eggs. Advent had similar restrictions, and every Friday they would take almonds, which were plants, so legal, grind them, mix them with water, and voila, almond milk. It's white, it's creamy, it's not dairy, it's a loophole. Almond milk wasn't a modern vegan fad. It was medieval ingenuity, perfect for days when the church banned dairy. Faith and flavor had to coexist somehow. They made fake butter out of almond milk. They made fake cream. They made fake cheese. The logic, therefore, was, if it lives in the water, it's a fish. What lives in the water? Puffins. They swim. They are fish. You can eat them during Lent. Beavers. They have a scaly tail. They swim. They are fish. You can eat them. Even barnacle geese, a goose that was believed to hatch from barnacles on driftwood, because no one saw them breed. They were born of the sea. They were fish. We call them anxiety, depression, trauma, chemical imbalances. We have tamed them. We have explained them. We have put them in bottles, which we get from a pharmacist. They had no such luxuries. Their demons were not psychological. Their demons were entities. They were real. They had names, ranks, preferences. They had physical bodies, or at least they could borrow yours. They were more real than germs, which no one had seen. France was under Cardinal Richelieu's iron rule, and his policies had tightened the noose on local autonomy. This is not background. This is the main plot. Richelieu, the Red Eminence, was a modern man. He was a consolidator. He was building France. And building a nation means demolishing local identity. Loudun, once semi-independent and Protestant-friendly, was now forced to bow under the growing power of the Catholic crown. The town was already unhappy. They were believed to lurk behind every illness, every temptation, every sleepless night. Priests preached of hellfire, women whispered of witches, and doctors carried more crosses than cures. Loudun's air was thick with incense, gossip, and paranoia, the perfect ingredients for disaster. And into this tinderbox walked the cast of our tragedy. First, the stage. At the center of this fragile calm stood the imposing convent of the Ursuline nuns. They are bored out of their minds. Their lives are rigidly ordered, prayers before dawn, silence after sunset, and no contact with men except for confession. Repression, boredom, class, resentment. This is not a convent. This is a pressure cooker. The convent was meant to be a sanctuary. Instead, it would become the stage for one of Europe's most chilling cases of mass hysteria. The town was ready to explode, and he made sure everyone else knew it too. This is not a good survival strategy in a small town. Grandier's intelligence was matched only by his defiance. This was his true sin. He was a political creature. He mocked the church hierarchy, challenged the town authorities, and refused to bow before Cardinal Richelieu's policies. He openly wrote pamphlets against Richelieu. The rejected appointment wounded the pride of the convent's prioress, a woman named Sister Jeanne des Anges, Sister Joan of the Angels. Even her name was theatrical. Jeanne was not just any nun. She was noble. She was intelligent. She was ambitious. And she was reportedly hunchbacked, small, and unattractive. She was a woman who had been denied power in the secular world of marriage and beauty, so she was damned well going to get it in the spiritual one. And Grandier, the beautiful, arrogant, powerful man, had scorned her. He had rejected her invitation. He had treated her and her convent as irrelevant. A woman whose imagination was as fervent as her faith, and that imagination, fueled by repression, boredom, and now scorn, went to work. At first, the local clergy dismissed it as hysteria or an outbreak of illness. The first wave of men who showed up were doctors and skeptical priests, who all said, "This is nonsense. This is a case of the vapors. This is female madness." But the behavior spread too quickly, too dramatically. Within days, nearly every nun was possessed. The show was too good. She began to speak in grand proclamations, calling herself both the bride of Christ and the victim of Grandier's sorcery. She was everything. She was the sinner and the saint. She was the battleground. Her small, hunchbacked body was now the single most important piece of real estate in France. Exorcists came and went, each eager to make a name for himself. The exorcist would shout, "And who sent you here?" And this was the moment the entire show was built for. The entire crowd would lean in. The scribes would ready their pens, and the demon would answer. "Urban Grandier," came the reply, always inevitably his name. Demons, it seemed, had remarkable consistency in their accusations. They were staying on message. What if the proof didn't come from men, but came from heaven or hell itself? Now, heaven itself appeared to accuse him. What better divine validation for removing a political nuisance than a demonic scandal conveniently tied to his name? Richelieu sent his own man down, Jean de la Bardemont, a man who knew what his job was. His job was not to find the truth. His job was to validate the narrative. The exorcisms changed. They stopped being spiritual. They became legal. They became an interrogation to build a case. Meanwhile, the exorcisms grew darker. The nuns were subjected to hours of prayer, fasting, and physical restraint. This only made the hysteria worse. They were sleep-deprived, starving, and in pain. Of course, they saw demons. Some fainted from exhaustion. "I am guilty only," he said, "of having offended powerful men." But it didn't matter. Reason had no place in Loudun anymore. The verdict was predetermined, and the execution date was set. The priest who once stood in the pulpit preaching salvation was now condemned as the devil's mouthpiece. Loudun had found its scapegoat and France its holy victory. On August 18th, 1634, Loudun gathered to witness what was billed as a divine victory, the burning of Father Urban Grandier. When it was over, the ashes were scattered, and the church declared victory. The demons had been expelled, the witch destroyed, and Loudun purified. But the air didn't feel cleansed. It felt hollow. And here is the punchline. Here is the cosmic joke. Here is the proof that the entire thing was a lie, from beginning to end. Section 4. Medieval Parisian brothels. The economy of sin and hypocrisy. We have just left Loudun. We have left that claustrophobic, hysterical, and ultimately lethal theater of the soul. We watched a man get burned by a fire lit by politics, but fueled by faith. We saw what happens when a society's spiritual anxieties curdle, and its demons are given a stage and a script. It was a world of vertical horror, a war for the soul, fought in the minds of repressed women and on the body of an arrogant priest. Now, we leave that world. We leave the supernatural horror, and we enter the mundane one. We are, in a sense, coming down. We are descending from the soul to the flesh. We are leaving the frenzy of the convent and entering the business of the brothel. The women, so, who lived in this shadow? Who were the women who serviced this economy? This is where we must destroy the next myth. The myth of the fallen woman. The myth of the temptress. The myth of the harlot with the heart of gold. These are fantasies invented by the very men who used them to make themselves feel better about the transaction. She had survived long enough for her looks to fade and her mind to sharpen, and she had graduated from labor to management. And what a manager she was. She was a CEO, she was a CFO, she was an HR department, and she was a bouncer. They handled accounts, paid guards for protection, and negotiated discreetly with city officials who pretended not to notice. The clientele. So, who was knocking on the door? Who were the men who funded this entire economy of shadows? The short answer? Everyone. When night fell over medieval Paris, its narrow streets filled with men seeking what daylight forbade. They came cloaked and hooded, muttering prayers one moment and knocking softly on shuttered doors the next. The customers of the Parisian brothels were a cross-section of medieval society. If the knight's motive was releasing pressure, the merchant's motive was a transaction. He was a man of the world. He was a capitalist. He had spent all day buying wool and selling wine. Now, he was going to buy pleasure. Brothels near the river did brisk business where wine flowed freely and conversation mixed easily with commerce. Deals were sealed over embraces, debts forgiven over laughter. Priests and friars sworn to chastity were often among the most loyal clients. This is the elephant in the room. This is the core of the hypocrisy. It's one thing for a knight or a merchant to sin. They are men of the world. They are expected to be weak. But the priest, the monk, his entire job, his one job, is to be better than that. He is the moral shepherd, and he is in the wolf's den. Some came in disguise, others openly, claiming spiritual guidance for the women. The ultimate cynical move. I am not a client. I am a missionary. I am here to save this poor, fallen creature. It may take all night. The hypocrisy was no secret. Everyone knew. The madam knew. The other clients knew. The city guard knew. A nobleman and a beggar might share the same wine jug or the same woman, both shedding their identities for a few hours of anonymity. When morning came, they'd vanish into the city's mist, each pretending the night had never happened. In medieval Paris, sin was democratic. Every man, regardless of title or robe, walked those alleys eventually, and every one of them paid the same price: silver for pleasure and silence for survival. The church's hypocrisy. And so, we arrive at the heart of the matter, the institution that made the rules, the moral center of the universe, the church. Officially, the church of medieval Paris thundered from the pulpit that lust was the gateway to hell, and they meant it. The sermons were terrifying. They were full of fire, brimstone, and elaborate, horrifying tortures for the lecherous. Legros is a wine merchant. On paper, the fact that Mr. Legros then sublets that property to a madam who runs a brothel, well, what can the abbey do? It's not their business. They can't be expected to know what goes on in every building. It's a lie. A polite, clean, lucrative lie. Everyone knows. No one speaks. The rent is paid on time. The money is washed clean by the time it gets to the altar. Some convents even owned properties later leased to madams, a convenient arrangement where holy funds and sinful profits mixed seamlessly. The bathhouses, the étuves, were notorious. They were the epicenter of the trade. And who owned the bathhouses? Often, the local church or monastery. They were a public good. Every so often, a new, pious pope or king would come to power. In 1254, King Louis IX, St. Louis, tried to abolish brothels altogether, calling them an affront to Christian virtue. He was a saint. He meant it. He rounded up the women, closed the houses, and it was a disaster. The city panicked. The men complained. The reports of rape and adultery, or at least the complaints about them, skyrocketed. The tax revenue vanished. The landlords, the church, lost their rent. Within a year, they quietly reopened, this time under new management, often municipal officials working in cooperation with church wardens. The experiment had failed. They had proven the theory. Sin was not optional. It was necessary. A priest might hear a man's sins on Sunday, then accept a discreet donation on Monday from the same establishment that caused them. The client goes to the brothel on Saturday night. He goes to confession on Sunday morning. He tells the priest, who might have been in the next room over, "Father, I have sinned." The priest assigns penance, and the penance always involves a donation. Give 10 shillings to the poor box. And where does the poor box money go? To the church. Redemption, it turned out, was available for a modest fee, payable in coin, not repentance. The sin was taxed. The absolution was taxed. It was the perfect, airtight economy. The church may have claimed to guard the gates of heaven, but in medieval Paris, it also leased rooms on the road to hell. You change the theology. You create a justification. You create the most powerful, cynical, and enduring argument in history. The argument of the lesser evil. To the moral eye, prostitution was sin. To the practical one, it was civic necessity. And few organizations in history have been as skilled at balancing holiness with hypocrisy as the medieval church. They found their answer in the greatest theologian of all. They are full of lust, a fact of the fall. That lust has to go somewhere. If you don't give them a safe, controlled, professional outlet, Where will it go? It will go towards your wife, adultery. It will go towards your daughter, rape divided by incest. It will go towards your son, sodomy, the greatest sin of all. A controlled outlet, they argued, kept men from corrupting respectable women. That was the key. The woman in the brothel was already damned. Her soul was already lost. So you could heap all the sins of the city onto her. She was the scapegoat. She absorbed the sin of the knight, the merchant, and the priest, and kept them safe for salvation. It was a perfect, theological, bulletproof justification. We leave the knight, and the merchant, and the priest, all vanishing into the Parisian mist, their footsteps echoing on the same stones, their sins confessed, or at least rented. We leave the women, the queens of shadows, to count the silver, to bolt the door, and to listen to the first, cold, judgmental bells of morning. We have walked from the frozen, honest hell of the mountain man, a world of ice and physical indifference. We have stood in the smoky, communal hell of the medieval kitchen, a world of class and ritualized survival. We have sat in the theatrical, psychological hell of Ludun, a world of hysteria, politics, and faith. And now we leave the commercial, hypocritical hell of the Parisian brothel, a world of moral plumbing and celestial accounting. We have seen, in essence, the four great forces that shape us: nature, hunger, God, and sex. We call it the dark corners of our digital world, the anonymous forums, the flickering screens where we channel the same lust, the same rage, the same desire, all while pretending to be civilized in the daylight. The Parisian church was just more honest about it. They knew the filth was real. They knew it had to go somewhere. So they built a pipe, and they taxed the pipe. It wasn't a place of pleasure. It was a waste management facility for the human soul. What else were they? They were banks. They were financial institutions. Not just because they made money. They traded in a currency far more valuable than silver: information. The madam, the queen of shadows, she was the most well-informed person in her district. We are the only animal that is ashamed of being an animal. Paris was just the battlefield where this war was fought most openly. The brothel was not a fortress for one side. It was the neutral territory. It was the Geneva where the angel and the ape met to sign their temporary truces. The angel would say, "I will allow you to survive in this room." The architecture of the soul reaching up, 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 away from the filth, away from the flesh, away from the ape, trying to touch the face of God. It is a stone prayer. It is a lie so beautiful it becomes the truth. It's a sermon. Now, stand on the same bridge. Turn your head 90 degrees. Look right. It's the architecture of the bed. The cathedral was built to save your soul in the next world. The room was built to save your body in this one, or at least make it feel good for a minute. The cathedral was built with faith. The room was built with biology. The cathedral was a sermon about angels and saints. The room was a whisper about flesh and need. And the city of Paris. It was the only place in the world that understood that you could not have one without the other. They are not enemies. They are a system. They are the two poles of the same magnet. The cathedral is the generator that creates the sin, by defining it. The brothel is the sewer that manages it. The confessional is the accounting office that closes the books. It's a perfect, self-sustaining economy. The light from the stained glass window of the cathedral at noon illuminates the image of the Virgin Mary. The light from the candle in the brothel at midnight illuminates the face of a woman named Marie. The city needs both lights. The city profits from both lights. This is the contradiction. And in this contradiction, we find the answer. And in that contradiction, Paris found its truest identity. This is the part we in our modern world get wrong. We hate contradiction. We hate hypocrisy. We demand purity. We want our brands to be ethical. We want our politicians to be clean. We want our food to be pure. And because we demand this impossible purity, we are forced to create even more sophisticated lies to hide the fact that we are not. We are a society of curated Instagram feeds, hiding the messy, horizontal chaos of our real lives. We are, in our own way, more hypocritical than medieval Paris ever was. Paris, medieval Paris, its identity was not purity. That ambition, that aspiration, that vertical impulse, that desire to be better than the ape, that is holy. The dream of the angel is sacred, even if the angel is a liar. Sinful, because it was human, because it was honest, because the ape was real, because the flesh was weak, because the appetites were strong, because biology always gets a vote. The war is not over. The contradiction is not resolved. We are still Paris. We are all of us. Right now, in our warm, centrally heated rooms, a walking, talking contradiction. We are all sacred in our ambitions. We are all sinful in our appetites. We all build our cathedrals, our LinkedIn profiles, our Instagram feeds, our public personas. Tonight, we're not looking at the architects of society. We're looking at the men who fled it. We're looking at the ghosts who lived in the margins. The footnotes of history, that smell of gunpowder, sweat, and frostbite. Tonight we begin with a group of men who spent their lives wrestling with nature and occasionally losing fingers to it. Let's pause on that phrase. Wrestling with nature. It sounds almost noble, doesn't it? It sounds like a fair fight. It conjures images of a brawny hero in a clean buckskin jacket, testing his mettle against a majestic, worthy opponent. Let me be the first to disabuse you of that notion. This was not a wrestling match. A wrestling match implies rules, a ring, a referee. A wrestling match implies both parties are aware they are in a contest. This was not a contest. It was a mugging. It was a desperate, one-sided dirt in the eyes, teeth on the boot brawl against an opponent that was deaf, blind, and infinitely powerful. Nature, in this context, wasn't a worthy adversary. Nature was a 10,000-ton block of ice that didn't know you were underneath it. You could scream, you could curse, you could bleed, you could pray, and the ice would not care. It would not notice. It would not slow. Its indifference was absolute. You were not wrestling with nature. The cover charge is one toe. You didn't just get frostbite. You earned it. It was a receipt. It was a lesson from the cold, reminding you that your body was just a collection of fragile, water-filled parts, and that it, the cold, was the universe's default setting. To lose a finger wasn't a tragedy. It was a transaction. It was proof that you had touched the void, and the void had, quite literally, taken a piece of you. You have the needs of a civilized man. You crave coffee. You crave whiskey. You crave salt. You crave the faint, dying echo of human contact. But you can no longer tolerate civilization. Its noise, its rules, its people, its softness. It feels like a cage. The air is too thick to breathe. The judgments are too loud. So you flee. But the wilderness does not accept you either. You are not a wolf. You are a clumsy, two-legged, soft-skinned creature that makes too much noise and smells wrong. They became, in a way, what they beheld. Their own hearts grew cold, hard, and efficient. They had to. Anything else, any warmth of sentiment, of doubt, of fear, that was a luxury. That was inefficiency. And the cold punishes inefficiency with death. And they did this long before central heating or good decisions existed. This is the punchline. This is the part that connects them to us, across the gulf of time, in the most cynical way possible. Central heating. Warmth was something you had to make every single day, from scratch. You had to fight for it with an axe and with flint. You had to build it, and then you had to guard it, like a newborn baby, because the wind and the snow were constantly trying to steal it from you. To them, warmth wasn't a right. It was a miracle. It was a temporary victory. It was a paycheck you earned every single hour by the sweat of your brow and the freezing of your fingers. Their decision to walk into the frozen heart of North America wasn't a good one. It wasn't a bad one. It was the only one. It was the last desperate act of men who were cornered. It was the choice of a man who decides to jump from a burning building. Is it a good decision to jump 20 stories? No. It's a terrible decision. But it's better than the other decision, which is to burn. They didn't choose the wilderness because it was good. They chose it because it was honest. Let's use this impossible, modern miracle of connection to look back into the frozen heart of the past. Let's use our warmth to understand their cold. Leave your comment. Stake your claim at this fire. Let us see the full, global, impossible breadth of our little tribe. And now that we are comfortable, now that we have acknowledged our warmth, our connection, and our pact, let's begin. It was the one true, noble calling. These men had tried it. They had tried to be virtuous. They had tried to plant the seeds, to build the fence, to join the civilized agrarian compact. And they had failed. The land had rejected them. The soil, in its own indifferent way, had looked at their efforts and said, no. To fail as a farmer in 1820 was not just an economic failure. It was a moral one. You had failed at the one thing that was supposed to make you a good American, a good man. You were, in short, a disgrace. Others were restless veterans, men who had tasted the high-stakes, high-volume chaos of the War of 1812, or some other smaller, forgotten border skirmish. They had learned to speak the language of lead and steel and immediate survival. And when the war ended, they were handed a shovel and told to reintegrate. They were told to find peace. But the peace of civilization was maddening. It was too quiet, and yet too noisy. And so, with no one left to talk to, they went to the one place where silence was not a punishment, but a fact. So, they packed up their questionable life choices and walked directly into winter. They didn't walk into the frontier. They didn't walk into opportunity. They walked into winter. They walked deliberately from the warm, judgmental lie of civilization into the cold, honest truth of the wilderness. And when they arrived, when they left the last town, a collection of 3 muddy shacks and a blacksmith behind them, they were baptized. They were reborn into a new and final reality. They entered the cathedral of the cold, or -40. The math is not in your favor. You can't intimidate it, bribe it, or reason with it. You cannot flatter the cold. You cannot appeal to its better nature. It has no better nature. It has no nature at all. It is just a state of being. It is the simple, brutal physics of heat transfer. The cold doesn't want to kill you. It just is. And you, by being warm, are in violation of its one simple law, that everything should be as cold as everything else. Your warmth is an act of defiance. You respect it. You read it. You become a scholar of its moods. You learn to listen to it. They learned that early, standing in snow up to their ribs, holding flint in one hand and regret in the other. That's the classroom. That's the university. The tuition is pain. The final exam is daily. And if you fail, you don't get a bad grade. You get an F for frozen. Their relationship with the cold was transactional. You respected it, and it sometimes let you wake up. You got cocky, and it reminded you who owned the landscape. Cocky was the great fatal sin. Cocky was deciding to not check your Tinder to make sure it was dry before you left camp. Cocky was deciding you could make it to the next valley before the storm hit, even though the air smelled wrong. Cocky was taking a shortcut across a patch of ice. Cocky was thinking, even for a second, that you were in charge. The cold wasn't a monster that leaped from the shadows. The cold wasn't malicious. It was efficient. It was an auditor. It was the ultimate, emotionless accountant of your survival. It didn't waste energy punishing you. It simply waited for you to make a mistake. It saw everything. It saw the tiny 3-stitch tear in your mitten. A civilized man wouldn't even notice it. It's just a small hole. The mountain man knew that hole was a mortal wound. It was a tiny, open door, and the cold, being efficient, would not pounce on that hole. They watched new arrivals from the east, fresh-faced dreamers who thought a wool coat was enough. They watched them, these greenhorns, with a mixture of pity and contempt. They saw in them the men they used to be, the men who still believed they were the main characters, the men who still believed in beating the cold. By nightfall, those dreamers were shivering philosophers, contemplating their choices and mortality in equal measure. A sacred, inviolable thing. The mountain man's mind thought of the body as a kit, a collection of tools, and some of those tools were expendable. Fingers, ears, noses, they all had expiration dates. You looked at your hand. You didn't see a hand. You saw a timeline. You saw a resource. You saw a collection of parts with varying degrees of importance. The trigger finger? That's essential. You guard that one. You sleep with that hand in your armpit, pressed against your own meager body heat. You learn to skin a beaver with a hand that was now more of a claw. You learn to prime your rifle in a gale with a numb, misshapen stump. This was the philosophy, born of the cold. They knew that pain was temporary, but stupidity was fatal. Pain was just information. That was its only job. Pain was your body's last desperate attempt to communicate. It was your nerves, freezing and dying, screaming, "Hey, idiot! We are in trouble. Do something." The civilized man wallows in pain. He sees it as an injustice. The mountain man listened to it. He heard the data, he assessed it, and he acted. Stupidity, on the other hand. Stupidity was a choice. Stupidity was sin. Stupidity was getting lazy. Stupidity was good enough. The cold didn't forgive poor planning. It didn't forgive "I'll do it tomorrow." It didn't forgive "that'll probably hold." It was the ultimate, unforgiving editor. It edited your lazy plan. It edited your good enough shelter. And if you weren't careful, it edited you right out of the story. The morning ritual was the perfect summary of this life. Waking up was not a gentle process. It was a resurrection. It was an act of pure, agonizing will. You weren't waking up. You were checking to see if you were still alive. When your beard froze solid and your coffee turned to slush before you could drink it, that was just mourning. The pun is perfect. It is mourning. You are mourning the warmth you just left in your fitful, terrified sleep. You are mourning the feeling in your extremities. You are mourning the man you used to be, the one who could drink a hot cup of coffee. Your beard is a cage of ice. Your breath, the very act of living, has frozen to your face. You have to break it. You have to snap the icicles of your own respiration, just to open your mouth. The coffee, that one tiny, pathetic link to the civilized world, that one luxury you afforded yourself, is a joke. It's a block of brown ice in a tin cup. You don't drink it. You gnaw it. The thermometer wasn't invented for them. They already had a better system. It was a simple binary system. If the whiskey froze, build another fire. This was the warning light. This was the check engine signal. When the alcohol itself, the one thing that was supposed to fight the cold, surrendered, you were in trouble. You were in a new, profound, next-level category of cold. And the second part of the system? If you froze, well, you probably wouldn't repeat the mistake. This is it. This is the entire punchline of their existence. Gallows humor as a survival mechanism. It is the ultimate expression of indifference matching indifference. The universe doesn't care if you die? Well, I'm not going to waste a lot of energy complaining about it. That was survivable. If it didn't make a sound at all, congratulations. You were in danger. That was the other kind of silence. The heavy, wet, slush silence. The silence of snow so saturated with weight and water that it was unstable. That was avalanche silence. That was widowmaker silence. This was the text they read every single day with their feet. They could smell a storm before it hit, taste the air for ice, and feel pressure drops in their bones. This wasn't mysticism. You learn it by spending 3 nights in a snowstorm, eating frozen jerky, and realizing that nature doesn't do refunds. You learn it by doing it. You learn it through the suffering. You learn it when the podcast is over and the app is dead and the central heating is a distant, warm memory. And it is just you and the snow and the silence. The mountain men didn't conquer the white silence. They just learned to speak its language. And the primary tool of survival, the only thing that stood between him and the cold, indifferent physics of the universe, was heat. Heat was not a feeling. It was a resource. It was a possession. It was the only money that mattered. Every spark, every ember, every half-alive flame was a paycheck from the universe saying, "Congratulations, you get to live another hour." Think about that. We live in units of days, weeks, months. We plan our futures. They lived in units of hours. Their future was the next piece of dry wood. Their retirement plan was making it to sunrise. Modern people treat warmth like a human right. Mountain men treated it like a miracle. We get angry when the heat breaks. We feel victimized. We call a number and we demand that someone come and fix it. We believe fundamentally that we are owed warmth. Their version of turning up the heat involved flint, frozen fingers, and the growing suspicion that God was laughing. Making fire was not a skill, like coding or playing the guitar. It wasn't a hobby. Making fire in a blizzard wasn't a skill. It was an argument with nature. And nature always had the better lawyers. It was a desperate, agonizing, high-stakes battle. Imagine, you are exhausted. You have been walking for 10 hours in waist-deep snow. The sun has set. The temperature is dropping like a stone. It is -20 and the wind is picking up. You must make fire. Not it would be nice to make fire. 6-degree furnace. From it, the -20-degree void. Mountain men discovered early that the best way to stay alive was to dress like a small bear and think like someone who'd already accepted his funeral. This is the 2-part system, the physical and the mental. First, the physical. They wore layers, not for fashion, but for negotiation. It was a constant, shifting, agonizing process of heat management. First came the shirt, usually wool, sometimes regret. The regret was when you wore cotton. Cotton was the greenhorn mistake. Cotton gets wet from sweat, from snow, and cotton stays wet. Cotton in the mountains was not a fabric. It was a shroud. It was a sponge that sucked the heat from your body. Wearing cotton was like sending a handwritten invitation to hypothermia. Wool. Wool was the miracle fabric. It gets wet, and it still insulates. It stinks. It's heavy. It itches, but it works. And the stinking part is not a joke. Washing those layers was unheard of. Why? Because 1. Soap froze. 2. Water froze. 3. Even the concept of cleanliness froze. What was the point? There was no one to smell you, except your horse, and your horse smelled worse. The smell was its own ecosystem. It was a record. It was a history, a combination of sweat, smoke, animal grease, and bad decisions. It was the physical armor. But it was also a biography. Your feet were never truly dry. You just managed the level of dampness. Every garment told a story, mostly about failure. That patch on the shoulder, a close encounter with fire, those seams near the knees, evidence of a fall that ended in creative cursing. A mountain man's wardrobe was not style. It was a scar tissueography. It was a map of his mistakes. I burned myself here. I fell there. Something tried to eat me here. It was an archive of survival. But the real insulation, the important insulation, that was mental. But the layers weren't just fabric. They were armor against madness. This is the part we forget. When you're weeks deep into solitude and your only conversation partner is your echo, a little weight on your shoulders reminds you that you still exist. The physical weight of the furs. It was an anchor. It was a fact. In a world of white silence, of indifference, of ghosts. The fancier trappers might have had fringed coats and moccasins, but under the aesthetics, they were all just cold and smelly philosophers mumbling about firewood and fate. And when the survival part was temporarily over, by spring, when the snow finally melted, they'd peel those layers off like tree bark, revealing the pale, malnourished human inside, blinking, dazed, and wondering why he ever left a warm bed for this life. It was a rebirth. It was a shedding. The fuel of the body. When it came to food, mountain men didn't eat for pleasure. They ate for thermodynamics. This is the final piece of the puzzle. We, in our modern world, have a complicated relationship with food. Food is love. Food is culture. Food is art. Food is guilt. Food is identity. For the mountain man, food was one thing, and one thing only. Calories weren't nutrition. They were firewood for the body. The body was a furnace. The cold was the void. Jerky was the main course, dessert, and moral support. It was food in its most abstract form. It was meat with all the life and water taken out of it. It was survival you could put in your pocket. It was tough enough to break teeth, which was fine because dental care was just don't die of infection. They hunted in silence, not out of respect for nature, but because chewing too loud could scare away dinner. A missed shot wasn't just a failure. It was a week of hunger wrapped in regret. Think about that. You, in your modern life, fail. You miss a deadline. You get a bad review. Their failure was immediate. You pull the trigger. Click. The powder is wet. And the elk, your walking furnace fuel for the next 2 weeks, just walks away. The silence that follows that click, that is the sound of despair. That is the sound of stupidity. They learned to use every part of an animal. This wasn't respect for nature. The mountain men understood something modern people still haven't grasped. The cold isn't cruel. It's honest. It's the only honest thing. It doesn't pretend to be anything it's not. It doesn't care who you are, what you believe, or how many layers of insulation you can afford. It just asks one question. Can you adapt? They answered that question the only way they knew how. By living long enough to become myths and dying long enough to be forgotten. Their bones became part of the landscape. Their names faded into creeks and valleys, and their legacy burned out like the final ember of a campfire left untended. But the lessons remain, buried under every snowfall, whispered in every gust of wind that rattles a cabin door. The cold still speaks the same language. We've just stopped listening, because somewhere deep in that frozen silence, the mountain men left behind a truth simple enough to survive extinction. Warmth is temporary, cold is forever. And the first thing that strikes you isn't the food. It's the smoke. It's a physical presence. It is an entity. It is not the polite, clean smoke of a modern barbecue. It is the thick, greasy, eye-watering, lung-blackening fog of a fire that is never, ever allowed to go out. It rolls and twists like a living creature, curling up from the great open hearth that dominates the room. This isn't your tidy modern stovetop with its polite gas flame. No, this is a fire. This is a monster. It was fish that was cheap, traveled well. Because it was so full of salt, it was immortal, and was approved by the church. Meat was a holiday. It was Christmas. It was Easter. It was the day the pig was killed. And that day was a ritual all its own. The entire village shared in it. You didn't roast the whole pig. You would be lynched. No, you processed it. You used everything. The blood was blood sausage, mixed with oats, of course. It was fuel for the human furnace, and it could not possibly be more different from the other kitchen, the one in the castle. The point of the food was to be a message, and the message was, I am so rich, I can afford to do this. I can afford to waste this much. I am a god. You are an insect. Now, watch my magic. And the magic was the food. Swans were roasted whole and redressed in their feathers for dramatic effect. Let's analyze this. A swan is a terrible bird to eat. It is tough. It is oily. It is stringy. It tastes like a muddy boot. So why eat it? You don't eat it, you look at it. Peacocks were stuffed, gilded, and paraded like edible trophies. Same logic. A peacock tastes worse than a swan, but it looks magnificent. So you cook it, you refeather it, and then, just to add to the insult, you gild it. You paint its beak and feet with gold leaf. You are eating gold. The medieval elite loved the idea that a meal could double as a performance, something to remind everyone at the table of their divine right to overindulge. This was the subtlety, or entremet. This was the halftime show of the medieval feast. It was food that was not food. It was food that was art. A sculpture made of sugar, we'll get to that, of a castle or a knight, a pig's head, cooked but dressed in a jester's hat, a pie that, when you cut it, 24 blackbirds, or, more likely, pigeons, flew out. Think about this. This is insane. This is waste as art. And, just like the mountain man, the noble had a practical side to his food. But it wasn't about surviving winter. It was about time. Food wasn't just eaten. It was preserved like treasure. Salted, smoked, and pickled stores. But not just herring. Pickled peaches, smoked salmon, salted beef tongue. It was survival, yes, but survival with style, the power of spice. If the medieval kitchen had a secret weapon, it was spice. This is the nuclear option of the medieval world. Not the kind you sprinkle on your fries, but treasures worth their weight in gold. And that is not a metaphor. That is accounting. Cinnamon from Ceylon, Sri Lanka, black pepper from India, and cloves so rare that owning a pouch could make you the envy of a court. These spices were not food. They were geopolitics. They were the oil of the 14th century. It cost me, your lord, more than your entire hut. Now, eat it. All carried across continents by traders who risked pirates, plagues, and deserts to deliver flavor. And the flavor itself was, interesting. To modern palates, medieval food might seem oddly sweet. That's because sugar was considered a spice, too. It was not dessert. It was yellow pepper, saffron, black pepper, pepper, and white pepper, sugar. It was just another expensive imported dust. There were skulls who scrubbed cauldrons black with soot, kneaders who wrestled bread dough like prize fighters, and master cooks who orchestrated it all like generals before battle. Orders flew, pans clanged, dogs loitered for scraps, and the scent of roasting meat mingled with wood smoke and sweat. It was chaos, but for all the frenzy, There was real science, or what passed for it. They had a theory. They had a unifying idea of how the universe works. He might explode. This was the science. Still, mistakes happened. Too much salt could ruin a feast. A smoky fire could blacken a whole boar. An undercooked poultry might send an entire noble family running for the privy. They didn't know about salmonella. They just knew that undercooked chicken made you sick, probably because it was too moist and unbalanced your humors. There were no thermometers, no timers, no second chances. Was a fish day, a fast day, and Wednesdays, and Saturdays. In some monasteries, over half the year was fasting. The logic was spiritual but also practical. Spiritual: mortify the flesh, control your appetites, remind yourself of Christ's suffering. Practical: by limiting meat, the church preserved livestock and stretched scarce resources. It was environmental policy disguised as theology. They spent a fortune, almonds were expensive, to get around the spirit of the law while obeying the letter of it. In wealthy homes, fasting was an excuse to flaunt wealth by serving exotic sea creatures like sturgeon or porpoise, considered suitable for Lent because they lived in water. This was the greatest loophole. The church, run by monks who were scholars, read Genesis, and Genesis says God created birds of the air and fish of the sea. Behind its walls lived young women from noble families sent there to find holiness, or at least to avoid scandal. Let's pause on this. A convent was not just a holy place. It was a storage facility. It was a polite prison. It was the place you sent your daughters when you had too many of them, and not enough dowries. The convent was ready to explode. All they needed was a fuse. All they needed was a villain. All they needed was a star. The accused. At the center of the Loudun affair stood a man who was as brilliant as he was doomed, Father Urbain Grandier. If the town was paranoia and the convent was repression, Grandier was arrogance. He was everything a 17th century priest was not supposed to be. Handsome, eloquent, arrogant, and dangerously charming. He wasn't just a priest, he was a celebrity. We think of priests from this era as humble, scholarly, pious men. He openly defended Loudun's independence, the dying Protestant autonomy. This was not just stupid, this was suicidal. He was a local politician tweeting insults at the Stasi. He was a political nuisance. But it wasn't his politics that would bring him down. It was his charm, or, to be less polite, his libido. Whispers followed him like incense smoke. Women, noble and common alike, sought him out for confession, and many lingered longer than necessary. He was the town's forbidden fruit. He was the one man who was supposed to be untouchable, and he wasn't. He was rumored to have fathered children, seduced widows, and used his pastoral visits for purposes that required no scripture. He was a walking scandal. He was an arrogant political opponent. He was a man with a reputation. He was, in short, a perfect target. He was the nail that had stuck up so high that the universe was now morally obligated to find a hammer. The accuser. The hammer was waiting. The hammer was sitting in the convent, bored, repressed, and ambitious. That scandal arrived when the Ursuline nuns came to town. Their new convent needed a spiritual advisor, and Grandier, as the most prominent priest in Loudun, was the obvious choice. Of course he was. He was the celebrity. Imagine the prestige. Imagine the gossip. The nuns wanted him. He was the prize, and claimed invisible hands touched them in the dark. This was the crux. This was the psychosexual heart of the matter. This was the only way a fine 17-3 in 17th century virgin could talk about sex. She couldn't talk about desire. She couldn't talk about the body, but she could talk about being assaulted by a demon. They built a special stage, Crowds gathered outside the convent gates, and later the church, to hear the nuns' screams, and priests conducted their rites with all the drama of a stage performance. It was the hottest ticket in town. It was reality television. Every convulsion, every blasphemy, every cry for deliverance drew gasps and applause from the onlookers. At the center of the storm was Sister Jean Desson, whose fits grew more extravagant by the day. He had written that pamphlet. He had defended the Protestants. He was a thorn in the side of the state, and you couldn't just arrest a popular priest for political opinions. That would make him a martyr. But what if he wasn't a political opponent? What if he was a sorcerer? What if he wasn't guilty of treason, but of heresy? Others developed wounds they claimed were inflicted by invisible claws. Physicians began to suspect hysteria. The rational doctors were still there, saying, "This is madness. They are ill. They are not possessed." But their skepticism was drowned out by the church's conviction, and more importantly, by the state's ambition. Richelieu's man had all the proof he needed. Each new fit became proof of possession, each scream a sermon against sin. By the spring of 1634, Loudun had become a magnet for pilgrims, gawkers, and zealots. The town's faith had curdled into obsession, and far away, Father Grandier could already feel the noose tightening around his soul and his neck. He knew. He knew they were coming for him. He had offended the nuns by scorn. He had offended the clergy by arrogance. And he had offended the king by politics. The climax. By the time Father Urban Grandier was arrested in 1634, his guilt had already been decided. The church didn't need proof. It had theater. The possessed nuns of Loudun had shouted his name too many times to ignore. But the state loves paperwork. Even a show trial needs evidence. So Richelieu's agents provided it. They were written in mirror-image Latin. They had spidery, occult-looking sigils next to the names. It's the kind of thing a 1-2-year-old boy would invent to scare his sister. And it was presented as State's Exhibit A. Grandier was dragged in chains through the streets, jeered at by the same townsfolk who once admired his wit and sermons. The crowd always turns. It's what they do. The courtroom, packed with spectators, lapped it up. It was equal parts sermon, spectacle, and witch trial. When the judges presented the so-called demonic contract, Grandier laughed. A fatal mistake. You do not laugh at the show. You do not point out that the emperor's new clothes are absurd. His mockery was painted as arrogance, his confidence as the devil's pride. "See," they said, "he mocks the evidence. He mocks the court." His body bruised, yet his face remained eerily composed. Eyewitnesses said he looked more like a martyr than a sorcerer. The executioners offered him one final chance to confess, to beg forgiveness and name accomplices. He refused. Instead, he prayed aloud for mercy on those condemning him, insisting that his soul was innocent even if his body was not. Before the flames were lit, one of the exorcists, Father Lactance, attempted to bless the fire, shouting for the demons to depart. Some priests quietly questioned the trial's fairness. Physicians spoke of hysteria and manipulation, and even the king's court, once eager to please Richelieu, grew uneasy about the spectacle. Grandier's execution was meant to silence scandal. Instead, it immortalized it. He died proclaiming innocence, burned by a church that mistook politics for exorcism and faith for fire. And in the flickering light of his pyre, Loudun's demons didn't vanish. They only changed faces. It is replaced by the smell of hot bread, spilled wine, the cheap kind, stale beer, unwashed bodies, and something else, that faint, sweet, rotten scent of desire for sale. The same city that built towering cathedrals also built an underground network of desire. But underground is the wrong word. Underground implies it was hidden. It was not hidden. It was right there. It was in the public bathhouse. It was in the upstairs room of the tavern. It was in the house with the discreetly painted shutter. It wasn't a sewer. It was a shadow. And a shadow requires a light. The brighter the light of the cathedral, the darker and sharper the shadow it casts. The church did not defeat sin. The church created the market for it. Students from the Sorbonne debated theology. We will get back to them. And beggars waited by the bridges for coins or confessions. Yet behind this noisy respectability, another economy thrived. One that traded not in gold or grain, but in pleasure. Pleasure was the currency. Hidden between bakeries, taverns, and wine cellars were the masons' closes, discreet brothels known only to those who could afford sin and silence. This was the key. Sin and silence. You paid for the act. You paid extra for the discretion. They weren't marked by any signboard or lantern. Later, in some places, they would be forced to have a red lantern to brand them. But in this era, discretion was the point. A flicker of candlelight in an upstairs window, a curtain drawn twice, or a loaf of bread left intentionally uncut could serve as the signal. It was a city of codes. For those in the know, Paris was a map of temptation drawn in invisible ink. And who held the pen? Who drew the map? The church thundered from the pulpit that lust was mortal sin. Yet Parisian priests walked past these brothels every day. They had to. The brothel was right next door to the bakery, which was right next door to the church. They denounced vice in sermons, then quietly blessed the men who profited from it. Places where men could indulge what the church forbade, and then return to confession cleansed and ready to sin again. It was a perfect closed loop, a perfect economy. Sin, confess, donate, repeat, lust, absolution, payment, lust. It was a subscription service for the soul. To a foreign visitor, Paris might have seemed holy, a city crowned by Notre Dame and ruled by devotion. But those who lived there knew better. Behind every convent was a tavern. Behind every chapel, a bed for rent. Knights, merchants, and clerks of the church all walked the same narrow alleys after dusk. Their armor or robes traded for anonymity. The brothels of medieval Paris were not just dens of desire. They were mirrors. In their candlelight flickered the hypocrisy of an age that worshipped chastity, but lived off temptation. Sin was not the city's secret. It was its second heartbeat. Choice is a product of safety, wealth, and options. These women had none of those. This was not a choice. This was a result. It was the answer to a brutal equation. What was the equation? Poverty, war, and hunger drove countless women to the city. You are a young woman on a farm. The harvest fails. The famine comes. Your father has a choice. There at least they had food, warmth, and a roof. Privileges not guaranteed to the respectable poor freezing outside. Was the life good? No. It was brutal. But it was warmer than the street. It was less hungry than the farm. It was a trade. A hated trade. A damned trade. But it was a trade. And inside this world, a new hierarchy was born. She was the ultimate hypocrite wrangler. She knew the name of the local priest's favorite girl. She knew how much to bribe the city guard to look the other way. She knew which bishop's assistant was handling the rent for the building, which the church owned. Many were wealthier than the merchants who sneered at them in public. This was her power. Some saved enough to escape the trade, marry, or open small taverns. The line between a tavern keeper and a brothel keeper was very, very thin. Others succumbed to illness, violence, or exhaustion. Syphilis was not yet the Great Plague, but other diseases were, and childbirth. A pregnancy was a death sentence. Their names recorded only in tax rolls and parish ledgers. A noble lady knew her husband as a performer, in his armor playing the role of lord. The prostitute knew him as a sweaty, insecure, whispering animal. She knew the truth. Behind every veil and painted face, was a story of survival. Women who learned to navigate hypocrisy better than any bishop or baron. The church damned them. Men desired them, and Paris depended on them. They were outcasts, and yet somehow indispensable. Can you pay, yes or no? First, the obvious ones. Knights fresh from battle, merchants heavy with coin. The nobility were the most predictable visitors. The knight was the A-list client. He lived in a world of profound contradiction. His job, his entire social purpose, was chivalry. And chivalry was a performance. It was an elaborate, beautiful lie. It demanded that he honor women, protect the weak, be pious, be chaste. It was a cage of impossible virtue. So, when he came to the city, he needed a place to take the armor off. Not just the metal armor, the moral armor. Chivalry demanded that he honor women, but only certain kinds. He had to honor his wife. He had to honor the queen. He had to honor the Virgin Mary. For the merchant class, pleasure was another kind of transaction, one they could afford. It was an asset. It was networking. It was the medieval equivalent of the golf course or the strip club. And then, the students. And university students, drunk on wine, and even the occasional monk. The Sorbonne was the intellectual heart of Europe. They wrote bad, erotic poetry to the women. They tried to pay in logic. They started fights. They were the worst, but they were a staple. They were learning about the world they were supposed to preach against. And that brings us to their teachers, the most controversial and most powerful visitors. But the most controversial visitors were the clergy. Even chroniclers joked that half the city's holy men kept private ministries in tavern backrooms. The jokes were everywhere. The songs, the poems, like Chaucer. Everyone knew the friar was a lecher. It was the world's worst kept secret. And the church. What did it do? Yet the church turned a blind eye, preferring sin behind closed doors to scandal in the streets. It was damage control. A priest has needs. Better he satisfy them discreetly, with a professional who knows how to keep a secret and who is already damned, than he do what the parish priest in the next town over did, which was seduce the mayor's wife. That is a scandal. That tears the fabric of society. That makes the church look bad. This is just housekeeping. The brothel was a strange equalizer and a fantastic source of revenue. And then, the tax. If you can't be the landlord, you can be the taxman. The city of Paris, and by extension the king, and by extension his bishops, levied a direct tax on prostitution. Sin was a line item in the budget. And if you are going to tax something, you have to regulate it. You have to make it official. It served two purposes. One, it prevented a client from accidentally soliciting a virtuous woman, protecting the good wives. Two, it told the client exactly who was available for purchase. The church had invented the uniform of the trade it officially condemned. The papacy periodically condemned this hypocrisy, but only when politically convenient. The king may have worn a halo, but the tax collectors knew where salvation really came from. And the final act of hypocrisy. Confession also played its part in this double game. This was the genius. The church profited from the sin on the front end, the rent, the tax. And it profited from the sin on the back end, the confession. Saint Augustine. Augustine had lived in a world, Rome, that was full of brothels. And he wrote, "What is a brothel? A brothel," he said, "is a sewer. It is a filthy, disgusting, vile place." But, he asked, what happens if you remove the sewer from the city? The filth doesn't disappear. It spreads. It runs down the main street. It poisons the palace. It allowed a priest to own a brothel and call it an act of charity. He wasn't profiting from sin. He was managing it. He was containing it. He was protecting the flock. It was the most beautiful, intricate, and damnable lie ever told. And it worked for 300 years. Conclusion. So, we leave them there. And in every single story, we have found the same repeating, cynical truth. That humanity is a creature defined by its ability to build a beautiful, elaborate, and necessary lie to cover the simple, brutal, and inconvenient truth. The mountain man lied that he was free when he was a slave to the fur trade and the cold. The noble lied that his feast was art when it was power, waste, and a disguise for rot. Pleasure was the product. It was not the point. Pleasure was the lure. It was the bait. The real function of the maison close was not physical. It was psychological. It was social. It was theological. What else were they? They were confessionals. They were, in fact, more honest than the ones in the church. Think about it. A man goes into the dark wooden box of the official confessional. What does he do? He performs. He edits his sins. He kneels. He whispers. He offers a curated, pre-approved version of his weakness to an official representative of God. He is acting the part of the penitent sinner. It is a script. Now, that same man, hours later, in the brothel, he is not performing penitence. He is living sin. And in that moment, in the shame, or the drunkenness, or the post-coital despair, he talks. He talks to the woman, the expendable one, the ghost. And he doesn't confess the sin. He confesses the reason. He confesses his fear, his doubt, his hatred of his wife, his insecurity about his wealth, his terror of the upcoming battle. He tells the truth. He tells the truth to the one person in the world who doesn't matter. The woman in the brothel heard a confession that the priest never did. The brothel knew the soul of Paris better than the cathedral. It wasn't a place of pleasure. It was a place of truth. It wasn't a place of pleasure. It was a clearinghouse for the city's most dangerous commodity, the truth. And finally, they were mirrors. That is what we said. But a mirror is a terrifying thing. We love to look in a mirror when we are dressed for the ball. When we are in our armor, our robes, our silk, we see the performance, and we are pleased. The angel was the vertical impulse. The angel said, "We must build a monument of stone and glass so tall it scrapes the heavens. We must build something that denies our animal nature. We must build something that proves we are better than the mud. We must build a cathedral." And so they did. It took 100 years. It was an act of pure, insane, glorious faith. But you must be discreet, and you must pay a tax, and you must confess to me in the morning. And the ape would say, "Fine, now get out of the way. I'm cold." This is the war. It's a negotiation. And Paris was the negotiating table. A city that built cathedrals to save souls, but also built rooms to tempt them. This is the visual. That is the most cynical and the most mature form of civilization. The identity of Paris was not the cathedral. The identity of Paris was not the brothel. The identity of Paris was the hyphen between the two. It's the city that understood that to be human is to be at war with yourself. One cannot exist without the other. This is the final truth. The city was sacred, sinful, and eternally. Let's say the words one last time. Sacred. Because it was. Because it believed. Because it tried. Because it built Notre Dame. Because it believed genuinely that the soul mattered. Because it knew it was flawed, and it built a system to accommodate that flaw. It did not judge the sin. It commercialized it, which is perhaps the most profound sin of all. Eternally. Ah, this is the punchline. This is the part where the mirror turns back on us. Eternally. Because this story is not over. It is not a history lesson. It's a diagnosis. And we all have our hidden rooms, our browser histories, our private thoughts, our secret fears. We are all at war with ourselves. The only difference is, Paris was honest enough to build a city out of it. We just build a website. The story is the same. The hypocrisy is the same. The identity is the same. It's just us. Sacred, sinful, and eternally. Hey guys, tonight we begin. We start this session, this communion in the digital darkness, huddled around the faint, cold glow of our screens. We are here, you and I, participating in this strange modern ritual. You are somewhere in the world, comfortable, I hope. Perhaps you are warm, perhaps you are settled. You are simply trying to not be erased by it. You are an ant trying to inconvenience a glacier. And the occasionally losing fingers part. How wonderfully, terrifyingly casual. Occasionally, as if it were a seasonal annoyance, like chapped lips or a head cold. But this is the key to understanding them. This is the price of admission. You want to live free? You want to escape the taxman, the priest, and the nagging judgment of your neighbors? The wilderness smiles and says, certainly. It was a reminder that you were edible, you were freezable, and you were, in the grand scheme of things, utterly insignificant. And the men who survived this? The men who paid that toll in flesh and kept walking? They weren't heroes. They were just stubborn. They were the men who looked at the void, spat in its general direction, and said, not today. These men, these survivors, these walking monuments to sheer, unadulterated grit, these were the mountain men. Yes, the mountain men. He is there to satisfy a fashion trend in London or Paris. He is a capitalist, in his own way. He's a cog in a machine, even if he's the cog that's furthest from the engine. He has a purpose, a grim, bloody, economic purpose. He is there to trap, to skin, to cure, to pack, to sell. It's a job, a horrible, cold, soul-crushing job. But then there's the wanderer. The wanderer has no purpose. The wanderer is not going somewhere. He is away from somewhere. He is defined by his lack of destination. He is a man in motion because to stop moving is to be buried, either by the snow or by the thoughts he's been running from. The wanderer isn't seeking profit. He's seeking, what? Oblivion? Silence? A place so empty it can finally absorb the noise inside his own head? The mountain man was both. He was a walking, paradoxical nightmare. He was a greedy hermit. He was a capitalistic mystic. Could you make fire? Could you read the snow? Could you tell the difference between the sound of the wind and the sound of a grizzly? If you could, you were granted another 24 hours. If you could not, you were deleted. You became a statistic. You became, quite literally, part of the landscape, a frozen lump, a cautionary tale for the next man to find. The men who went there didn't just visit the cold. They mainlined it. They injected the frozen heart directly into their own. Let's talk about that. It's not just a radiator. It's not just a furnace. Central heating is a philosophy. It's a statement. It is the single greatest act of human arrogance. Central heating is man looking at the universe, at the cold, dark, indifferent void of winter and saying, no. It is the idea that your comfort is not negotiable. It is the idea that you are the master of your environment. It is the idea that you are, and should be, permanently insulated from reality. And the consequences were immediate, and they were final. So, here we are, in our warm rooms, with our central heating, with our lives that are for the most part the product of 1,000 good decisions we didn't even know we were making. We are soft, we are safe, and we are, let's be honest, comfortable. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to really feel that comfort. Feel the warmth in the room. Feel the lack of a howling wind trying to steal your body heat. Feel the simple, profound luxury of not being in mortal danger. Acknowledge the vast, unbridgeable chasm between your life and the one we are about to discuss. We are sitting at the digital, global fireside, about to tell ghost stories about men who were colder than any ghost. And as you sit in that comfort, as you prepare to be a spectator to their suffering, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's the modern ritual, isn't it? It's the small, digital applause. Men who might not see another human face for 6, 8, or 12 months. Men whose only conversations were with their horse, or their rifle, or the echo of their own voice cursing the wind. Their isolation was as vast as the continent itself. And here we are. You are in London at 3 a.m. You are in Sydney at noon. You are in Ohio at 10 p.m. You are in Mumbai, in Manila, in Berlin, in Buenos Aires. You are everywhere. Section 1. The Mountain Men. Survival against indifferent nature. The mountain men weren't heroes. Let's start there. Let's dismantle that myth before we even light the first fire. We have this image, don't we? The stoic, rugged individual. The man who is one with nature. The noble Jeremiah Johnson, living in harmony with the land, his face etched with wisdom and a quiet, profound integrity. We love this image. We need this image. The wilderness was the only place left on the map that offered the same stakes as the battlefield. And then there were the men who had simply run out of people willing to tolerate them. This, perhaps, is the most honest category. These were the men who were abrasive. The men who couldn't or wouldn't play the social game. The men who were born with a fundamental lack of respect for authority. The sandpaper on the smooth, polite surface of society. They were too loud, too quiet, too drunk, too something. They were the man in the back of the church who laughed at the wrong time. They were the man who looked the town banker in the eye and called him a thief. They were the man who saw the social contract for the flimsy, polite fiction that it was, and said so. And society, in its slow, grinding, judgmental way, had cast them out. They were ostracized, ridiculed, and finally ignored. They were social lepers. They had run out of people. We see the weather as an adversary, an inconvenience to be overcome, to be dominated. The mountain men knew better. You don't beat weather, you survive its mood swings. This is a philosophy of submission, not submission to a will, but submission to a fact. You cannot beat a blizzard. That's like trying to beat an earthquake. To even try is an act of such profound arrogance that the wilderness will punish it with a speed and finality that is almost comical. No, you don't beat it. The pinky on your left hand, that's negotiable. That's a luxury. When the tip of that finger turned white, waxy, and dead, when you could tap it on a tree trunk and hear a dull click, you didn't panic. You didn't weep for the loss. You didn't complain. You just learned to do everything left-handed. You were not a man who had lost a finger. You were a man who was now more efficient. You had one less thing to keep warm, one less liability. You adapted. The white silence. In the mountains, silence isn't peace. It's a warning. We, in our noisy world, fantasize about silence. We buy apps for it. We go on retreats for it. We meditate. Our silence is a luxury. It's an escape. It's a comfortable, padded, warm, safe void that we get to control. The silence of the high Rockies in January is none of those things. It is not a void. It is a presence. It is a 10,000-ton weight of nothing pressing in on you from all sides. It is not peaceful. The world was one long, unbroken whisper. Snow, wind, and the sound of your stomach regretting breakfast. They called it the white silence, not because it was pretty, but because it was absolute. It was a silence that ate sound. You could scream into it, and the echo would die faster than a campfire in a blizzard. Try it. Go ahead. Stand on that ridge, fill your lungs and scream your rage, your fear, your loneliness, your name into the void. The sound travels about 10 feet, and then it just stops. The snow, the trees, the sheer, dense cold of the air, it smothers it. Instantly. It's the ultimate, you do not matter. The universe didn't even bother to send your voice back to you. This is a profoundly humbling and terrifying experience. It's the sound of your own insignificance. And the mountains? The mountains didn't care about your feelings. They wanted obedience. This wasn't a relationship. It was a dictatorship. A sudden silence in the woods meant something nearby was considering you for dinner. This was the difference. The civilized man thinks. He ponders. He reflects. The mountain man noticed. Even the animals were meteorologists. When the crows flew low, snow was coming. When the wolves went quiet, it was already here. They learned to stop trusting their own complex, civilized thoughts. They learned to trust the data, and the data was everywhere. The animals knew. The trees knew. When you finally saw that flicker of orange light through the dark, it felt holy. It was holy. It was the only holiness. It was life. It was a no to the universe's yes. But fire wasn't just warmth. It was companionship. This is the part we, in our connected world, can't understand. A campfire was the only voice that answered back. The silence of the mountains was absolute. The cold was indifferent. The wind was a bully. The fire was alive. It crackled, it hissed, and it threw light into a world that wanted you gone. It was the only friend you had. It was the only thing in that entire frozen landscape that was on your side. It was the only other warm thing for 1,000 miles. Sitting near it, wrapped in animal hides, you didn't think about philosophy or poetry. You were beyond that. You thought about how long it would last and whether your boots would catch fire before your toes froze off. It was a constant, paranoid negotiation. The fire taught you efficiency. You didn't waste a single BTU. You learned to cook everything directly on coals. Meat, snow, optimism. You didn't boil water if you didn't have to. You just melted snow. You drank it lukewarm, full of ash and soot. It was wet. It was warm. It was enough. You stopped wasting time making coffee because it froze halfway through the pour. You ate it like a popsicle and called it frontier style. This wasn't a joke. This was adaptation. Oh, my hot liquid turned into a solid? I guess I'm eating a solid now. You didn't complain. You adapted. They knew that warmth was temporary, fragile, and always earned twice. Once with sweat and once with smoke. It was never free. It was never guaranteed. If you got careless, the wind took it. If you slept too close, the sparks took you. Fire demanded respect. The same respect as the cold. It was not your pet. It was a wild animal you had temporarily chained. It was a deal you had made. It would keep you alive, but it would also try to kill you. It would burn your blankets. It would set your shelter on fire. It would fill your lungs with smoke. It was a double agent. When the night stretched too long and the temperature dropped past the point of argument, the mountain men didn't beg for warmth. They built it. They didn't expect comfort. They created survival. And that, in the end, is the difference. We live surrounded by heat and still complain of being cold. We have our central heating. We have our electric blankets. We have our heated seats. We are bathed in effortless artificial warmth. And we are, as a people, spiritually, emotionally, freezing. They lived inside winter itself and considered it just another evening. They lived in a world of absolute, profound, lethal cold. And in their frostbitten, half-dead hearts, they had a single, tiny, flickering ember of fire. The simple, dumb, heavy fact of your 50-pound buffalo coat was a comfort. It was a constant physical hug that said, "You are here. You are real. This is heavy." The fur, the smell, the constant discomfort. It kept you tethered to the real world, however miserable it was. This is the paradox. Comfort makes you crazy. When you're comfortable, your mind wanders. It worries. It frets. When you are in constant, low-grade physical discomfort, your mind is focused. It's present. The only way to fight the cold, or rather negotiate with it, was to make heat. And the only way to make heat was to burn fuel. Food was fuel. If it burned, it worked. If it didn't, you died slightly more poetically. Dinner was whatever didn't kill you first. There was no menu. There was no choice. They boiled, roasted, or occasionally just gnawed on whatever moved slower than they did. Beaver tail was considered a delicacy. Why? Not because it tasted good. Your body burns more calories processing the lean meat than it gains from it. You could die with a full stomach of rabbit. The wilderness was full of these ironic traps. Here is food, but surprise, it kills you. The menu changed depending on how desperate you were. In good weeks, you might get rabbit stew, but you'd better add some beaver grease to it. In bad weeks, you might eat the same rabbit twice. I will leave that to your imagination. Everything was whatever you caught before it froze. Coffee was made from roasted chicory, and whiskey was basically medicine that happened to be fun. Today, people count macros and talk about clean eating. A mountain man's diet was simple. If it kept you warm, it was good. If it didn't, you wouldn't be around to complain. They didn't eat to live well. They ate to keep living, which, in their world, was already ambitious. It was just fur again. The capitalist part of their greedy hermit identity evaporated. And at the exact same time, civilization crept west. The indifference they had fled had followed them. And with it came railroads, telegraphs, and too many people who thought frostbite was a myth. It came with rules. It came with structure. It came with judgment. The very noise they had walked into winter to escape was now here. The wilderness was shrinking, and the difference between the two, that fragile flame between life and oblivion, is still the only thing that ever made us human. We just left a world of ice and silence, and men who had become as hard and cold as the landscape that was trying to erase them. We left a world of pure, brutal, physical honesty. A world where the only sin was stupidity, and the only law was physics. Now, we're going home. We're going inside. We're going to a place of civilization. This is a captured, angry God living in the center of the house. This is a fire big enough to roast an entire boar, heat a cauldron the size of a bathtub, and smoke half the family into submission before breakfast. There is no chimney, not as you'd understand it. There is, perhaps, a hole in the roof, a louver, but that is a suggestion to the smoke, not a command. The smoke, being a creature of pure, malicious physics, ignores this suggestion. It prefers to live in the room. It wants to paint the ceiling, the walls, and your lungs with a thick, black, sticky layer of soot. You don't work in this kitchen. You survive it. Your eyes are perpetually red. You have a cough you will never, ever get rid of. You smell, permanently, of ash and old fat. Yet this smoky chaos was the beating heart of every medieval home. This is the contradiction. This hell was the source of life. From the peasant's hut to the Lord's manor, here cooking wasn't just a chore. It was ritual, chemistry, and a touch of witchcraft all at once. It was ritual because you had to do it every day. It was the rhythm of life. It was chemistry because you were, quite literally, transforming inedible, raw grain, tough meat, poisonous when raw roots, into survivable, You were an alchemist, turning base materials into life. And it was witchcraft because, for most of the people doing it, the chemistry was magic. They had no idea why it worked. The cold of the mountain man preserved his mistakes and his body. The damp warmth of the medieval village feasted on them. There were no forks, only fingers, knives, and the occasional spoon for soups and stews. A shared bowl meant shared germs, and the idea of clean eating meant wiping your hands on whatever bit of bread or apron was closest. And yet, for all the rough edges, there was artistry here. It was the artistry of survival. It was the artistry of distinction. Let's talk about pottage. Pottage is the single most important and most honest word in the medieval culinary language. It is, essentially, a gray sludge. It was the eternal stew. In the corner of the peasant hut, over the meager fire, was the pottage pot. It never stopped simmering. It was never cleaned. Why? Because it was efficient. You started it in the morning. After you'd already done 2 hours of work, you threw in a handful of grain, barley, oats, and water. You throw it in the pot. At night, you come back. You eat the same pottage, but now it has onion in it. It is pottage with onion. It is a feast. The leftovers? They stayed in the pot. The next morning, you added more water and more grain. The pottage you were eating on Thursday had the memory of Tuesday's onion in it. This eternal stew was your refrigerator, your history, and your menu, all in one. It was a living thing, a culinary archive of your own grim survival. If it wasn't gray, it wasn't done. And meat? Meat was rare and precious. This is the part we always get wrong. We think medieval and we think giant turkey leg. That is a lie. That is a Hollywood fantasy. That is Disneyland. The reality of the peasant's life was vegetarianism, but not by choice. It was vegetarianism by poverty. A cow? A cow was a tractor. It was a plow puller. To eat the cow, that's like eating your John Deere. You don't do it. Not unless you are starving. A chicken? A chicken was an egg machine. An egg is a miracle. It is a daily protein. It is a gift from God. To eat the chicken, that's killing the machine. You only do that when the machine breaks. That is to say, the chicken gets too old to lay. Most peasants would have recognized the taste of salted herring more than roast beef. Salted herring was the protein of the masses. You have just ruined a pie. It's full of live, terrified, pooping birds. You have ruined the hall. It's now full of live, terrified, pooping birds. The ladies are screaming, and the Lord is laughing. That is power. Power is the ability to create chaos for fun and pay for it. The difference between classes was also measured in color and spice. The peasant's pot was gray. The noble's plate was a rainbow. Nobles craved saffron for its golden glow, to make food look divine, golden, sun-like. Imported pepper for its bite, and sugar for its luxury sweetness. All brought at great cost along the trade routes from Venice, Cairo, and the East. A pinch of spice could mark you as worldly. A dish without it might mark you as poor. Even the humblest cook knew that taste wasn't just about pleasure. It was about power. These weren't simply seasonings. They were symbols of power, wealth, and sophistication. A pinch of pepper on your stew. It was flexing a Rolex, as the prompt says. It was a message. And the message was, this dust, this black powder, it has traveled 10,000 miles. It has crossed deserts. It has survived pirates. It has passed through the hands of a dozen middlemen, each of whom risked his life and took a profit. Think turkey leg meets gingerbread. But, behind the glamour though, spices had a darker purpose. And this is the cynical, world-weary truth. This is the secret of the nobles' theater. They were the great disguises. In an age before refrigeration, Meat often arrived with a personality of its own, and not a pleasant one. The peasant ate his meat, the pig, immediately, and then salted it. It was safe. The noble demanded fresh meat. He lived in a castle. You add vinegar. You create a sauce so violent, so powerful, so aromatic, that it beats the rot into submission. The feast was not a symphony of flavors. It was a culinary war, being fought, in your mouth, between decay and geopolitics. The medieval cook knew this trick well, though they'd never admit it at the feast. But spices did more than hide sins. They also reflected superstition. This is where food becomes medicine, and this medicine was insane. The science of humors. Cooking in the Middle Ages was equal parts craftsmanship, improvisation, and controlled chaos. Forget the recipe book. It didn't exist. Why? Because most cooks, even the noble ones, were illiterate. They couldn't read. So, how did they learn? The same way the mountain man learned to read the snow. By doing, by watching, by failing. Except, when a mountain man failed, he died. When a medieval cook failed, the Lord got sick. Black bile, cold and dry. Melancholic, sad. Health was balance. Sickness was imbalance. If you were sick, it was because you had too much or too little of one humor. And food was the thermostat. All food also had a humor. Balance your ingredients or risk unbalancing the body. The cook was not a chef. The cook was a doctor. He was a pharmacist. The feast was a prescription. If a dish was too cold, like fish or lettuce, it needed heat. But for the noble cook, it was a catastrophe. His lord demanded a feast, even on a fast day. He demanded luxury. But the rules said no meat, no milk, no eggs, no butter. This is like telling a French chef he can't use butter. It's an insult. So, you cheat. Fish became the savior of the fasting table. Rivers, lakes, and coasts teemed with herring, eel, and cod. Though by the time it reached the inner continent, the fish might have traveled for weeks, salted into near immortality. But fish was boring. The Lord didn't want salted herring. So, creativity took over. In monasteries, inventive cooks found ways to turn fasting meals into gourmet puzzles. They crafted mock meats. They would take fish, like pike, grind it into a paste, and then sculpt it into the shape of a pig. Cooking for a saint's day or a wedding feast was a sacred duty, an act of devotion as much as indulgence. Even the timing of meals followed divine order. Monks ate in silence while scriptures were read aloud, turning dining into meditation. Peasants, meanwhile, prayed before each meal, and often left a small portion of bread for the spirits or the poor, because hunger, they knew, was never far away. In a sense, medieval cuisine wasn't ruled by hunger, but by holiness. The church dictated the menu as surely as the seasons did. Every loaf and ladle full reminded people that food was both gift and temptation, nourishment for the body and a test for the soul. Section 3. The Devils of Loudun. Hysteria, Politics and Zealotry. We have left the kitchen. We have left the world of body and sustenance, the world of smoke and pottage. We have left the horizontal, grinding reality of survival. Now we enter the vertical. We enter the world of the soul. And the soul, in the 17th century, was not a metaphor. It was not a concept. It was a battleground. It was prime real estate that two infinite superpowers, God and Satan, were fighting a total existential war for. And you, your body, your mind, your town. You were the muddy, bloody trench they were fighting in. This is the most important fact to understand. We, in our modern softness, have medicalized our demons. It was already resentful. It was losing its identity. The citizens grumbled in private, prayed in public, and eyed each other with a mixture of devotion and suspicion. This is the tinderbox. It was an age when faith and fear walked hand in hand. They were the same thing. To believe deeply in God required you to believe just as deeply in the devil. To have faith meant you must have fear. Demons weren't metaphorical. It was the place you sent the difficult one, the smart one, the ugly one, the one who looked at the stable boy twice. It was scandal avoidance. So, what do you have? You have a box. And inside this box, you have a dozen or so young, often teenage, women. They are noble, so they feel entitled. They are unmarried, so they are repressed. They are locked away, so they are bored. Grandier was a rock star. His sermons drew crowds from miles away, not because of divine inspiration, but because people liked watching him command a pulpit like a stage. He wasn't preaching, he was performing. He spoke with the flair of an actor and the confidence of a nobleman, and even his critics admitted through gritted teeth that he was magnetic. He knew he was smarter than everyone else. He knew he was better looking than everyone else. But when he refused the position, citing other duties, he inadvertently sealed his fate. This was the moment. This was the click of the trigger. Why did he refuse? Maybe he was too busy with his widows. Maybe he thought it was beneath him. Maybe he knew what a hothouse of hysteria a convent was and wanted no part of it. It doesn't matter. He said no. Soon after his refusal, Sister Jean began to claim that Grandier haunted her dreams. This is the key. This is the only way a 17th century nun can process this cocktail of emotions. She can't say, "I desire him." That's a sin. She can't say, "I hate him." That's unchristian. She can't say, "I envy his freedom." That's blasphemy. So, what can she say? She can say, "I am a victim. He is coming to me. My will is pure. His is corrupt." She said he appeared in her cell at night, whispering temptations and caresses, his form both angelic and demonic. It was the perfect narrative. It was the ultimate psychosexual fantasy. It allowed her to be obsessed with him in a way that was holy. She wasn't thinking about him. She was battling him. She wasn't lusting. She was suffering. She was the star of her own spiritual opera. Her confessions spread through the convent like wildfire. Of course they did. It was the most exciting thing that had ever happened. It was better than prayers. It was better than silence. It was drama. Within weeks, other nuns began to experience visions too. Hysteria is a social contagion, especially in a closed system. One nun starts shaking. The second nun thinks, "Wait, is that what we're doing? I can shake. Watch me." Plus, if Sister Jean is getting all this attention, where is my attention? "Oh, you saw him in a dream? Well, I saw him in a small demon named Beelzebub." Top that. Visions of Grandier's ghostly visits, of demons crawling through their rooms, of sin disguised as sanctity. The spectacle, it began quietly. It always does. A few sleepless nights, murmured prayers, and nervous laughter behind the convent walls. The giggles of a sleepover party that is about to go dark. But soon something changed. One by one, the Ursuline nuns began convulsing, shrieking, and collapsing in the chapel. The private fantasy had gone public. The performance had found its stage. And what a performance it was! In their minds, he was the one man who had the power to destroy them spiritually and save them from their boredom. Sister Jean Dange was the loudest of them all. Her confessions became performances, elaborate, emotional, and strangely captivating. She was the star. She was the lead actress. She was the screenwriter. She described how Grandier's specter entered her cell at night, his face radiant, his words blasphemous. She swore that he led an army of demons into the convent to seduce and corrupt them. She was a creative genius. She named spirits with grotesque names: Leviathan, Behemoth, Astaroth. She had been reading. She was pulling these names from demonology texts. She was doing her homework. This wasn't just hysteria. This was studied hysteria, and claimed they battled for her soul. It was a vacation from piety. The devil made me do it. Witnesses swore they saw impossible things: nuns floating inches above the ground, holy water boiling in its font, and crucifixes trembling on the walls. Witnesses see what Luke 17:3. They want to see. A crowd that is primed for a miracle or a horror will provide one for itself. The convent became a public spectacle. If you were a nobody priest from a backwater town, and you could successfully exorcise a demon named Leviathan, you were set for Read 17:3 life. You were a star. The nun's screams became the town's new soundtrack. But for all the talk of devils, the drama had a distinctly human undercurrent. Many noticed that the possessions grew more theatrical whenever an audience was present. This is the key insight. When the doctors came to examine them privately, the demons were often quiet, shy, or asleep. But when the handsome soldier, or the powerful bishop, or the gasping crowd was watching, the demons put on a show. The women seemed aware of who was watching: priests, nobles, or soldiers. And their fits grew wilder, their voices louder. They were actresses. They were playing to the house. And who better to play the villain than the defiant, unrepentant priest already whispered to have seduced half the town? The stage was set. The exorcisms were about to begin. The political motive. By 1633, Loudun had transformed into a circus of sanctity and spectacle. The quiet town was gone. It was now the spiritual capital of France. The convent's once quiet halls echoed with shrieks, chants, and the metallic clatter of chains. Exorcisms were no longer private rituals. They were public theater. This was the next evolution. They moved the show from the convent to the main church. She was in her element. She twisted her body into impossible shapes. She was a contortionist. Spat out holy water, a classic move, and claimed to see demons flying above the altar. During one exorcism, she reportedly floated a few inches off the ground. Eyes rolled back, mouth frothing, proof, the clergy said, that Satan had taken residence in Loudun, and Satan was making her a star. Jean, however, seemed strangely energized by the attention. And this is where the circus stopped being a local freak show and started being an instrument of the state. The church's hierarchy began taking notes. Reports of the possessions were sent to Richelieu's agents, who saw an opportunity in the chaos. Cardinal Richelieu did not care about demons. Richelieu cared about power, and Richelieu had a Grandier problem. Grandier had publicly opposed Richelieu's policies. He had sinned against sex, God, and the state. He was doomed. The priests leading the exorcisms claimed to have extracted signed pacts between Grandier and the devil himself, written in Latin and sealed in blood. This is not a joke. This document still exists. It is one of the most gloriously absurd and terrifying pieces of bureaucratic evil in history. The documents were laughably crude, filled with signatures of demons like Lucifer, Leviathan, and even Beelzebub, as if hell had a formal registry. He maintained his composure, insisting he was innocent, a victim of slander, jealousy, and politics disguised as piety. He was right, but Richelieu's agents had already smelled opportunity. The trial became more than a question of faith. It was a chance to crush a local critic of the crown. The machinery of church and state worked together with frightening efficiency. Witnesses came forward in droves: servants, exorcists, even the nuns themselves, each eager to prove their loyalty to God or to save their own skin. This is how witch trials work. The hysteria is weaponized into testimony. Their testimonies bordered on the absurd. They claimed Grandier had flown through the convent's windows, that he had sent demons in the form of black cats, and that his breath alone could corrupt virgin souls. They turned his bones to pulp. They demanded he name his accomplices. They demanded he admit his sin. Yet even in agony, he refused to admit to witchcraft. This was his one final act of defiance. The arrogance that had doomed him now became the only thing that saved his soul, if not his body. He would not give them the satisfaction. He would not validate their lie. The town square had been transformed into a holy stage. Soldiers kept order, priests led hymns, and merchants sold food to the swelling crowd. Everyone wanted to see the devil's servant perish. It was a holiday. It was a festival. The irony, of course, was that the only fire born of hell that day was the one lit by human hands. Grandier, gaunt and broken from torture, was brought out in chains. His legs were crushed. He could not walk. They carried him. And we will find, to our profound, cynical lack of surprise, that the hypocrisy is the same. The stage is different. The actors wear different costumes, but the play is identical. It is a story written, produced, and directed by men in robes, who preach one thing in public and profit from another in private. We move from the psychology of repression to the economy of desire. Welcome to Paris. In medieval Paris, sin and salvation lived side by side, separated only by the width of a street. This is not a metaphor. This is urban planning. This is a fact of geography. Look at the map. There, on the Ile de la Cité, is the thundering, glorious stone sermon of Notre Dame. Its spires are scratching at the face of God. Its bells are shouting the dominance of Christ. Every hour, on the hour. By making lust a mortal sin, it made it valuable. It made it dangerous. It turned an appetite into an addiction, and an addiction into a business. By day, monks walked the cobbled lanes, chanting psalms. By night, the same stones echoed with laughter, whispers, and the rustle of cloaks slipping into forbidden doorways. Paris was Europe's beating heart, crowded, chaotic, and intoxicating. Merchants shouted prices in the market, and, as we will see, often profited from it themselves. The truth was, the city's moral order depended on its hidden sins. This is the great, glorious, cynical truth. Brothels were the pressure valves of a society obsessed with purity. They were the place where the steam of the civilized man was allowed to escape, so that the engine of society didn't explode. The women who lived and worked in the brothels of medieval Paris were ghosts in daylight and queens at night. By day, they were invisible. They were nothing, less than nothing. Society had erased them. Society called them sinners, but in the dim glow of tallow candles, they ruled small kingdoms of their own making. But how did they get there? Most had not chosen this life. It had chosen them. Choice is a modern luxury. Feed you, who cannot work the plow, or feed your brother, who can. It's not a choice. It's math. You are sent away. You walk to the city. What are your job options? You can be a servant if you are lucky. And, as a servant, you will be starved, beaten, and raped by your master for free. Or this. You are a widow. An army passed through your village. Your husband is dead. Your house is burned. You have 2 children. How do you feed them? You can beg and watch them starve. Or this. Paris, for all its grandeur, offered few options. A woman without a husband, family, or trade was invisible, unless she sold what men most desired and most despised. Some came from the countryside, fleeing famine or the shame of bearing a child out of wedlock, the ultimate sin, to be ruined. A dark, matriarchal mirror to the patriarchal world outside. At the top was the madam. Inside the maison close, life had its own rules. Older women became matrons, madams, running the business with sharp tongues and sharper minds. This is the Queen of Shadows. She was, almost always, a woman who had done the work herself. She had survived. She had survived the disease, the violence, the childbirth. In an age when women couldn't own property legally, madams found creative ways to do so through fake names, male intermediaries, or church loopholes quietly ignored. She was a ghost in the system, a woman who was legally a nobody, but economically a somebody. She was the most powerful woman in Paris that you had never heard of. And for the girls under her, the younger women, for the younger women, the work was dangerous, but not entirely hopeless. The madam was their jailer, and also their only protector. She protected them from violent clients. She protected them, as best she could, from the law. She was their only recourse. It was a strange, toxic, codependent family. But they had one thing that the noble ladies in the castle did not have: knowledge. Despite their reputation, many prostitutes were surprisingly well connected. They heard secrets whispered by knights, priests, and clerks. A man, at the peak of his pleasure, or in the depths of his drunken guilt, talks. He talks about his wife. He talks about his business deal. He put them on a pedestal so high he couldn't touch them. But the lust was still there. The animal was still in its cage. The brothel was the solution. Courtesans were safe sin, neither wives nor virgins, existing to absorb the lust that polite society denied. These women were outside the system of chivalry. They didn't count. You could not dishonor a woman who was already considered dishonored. In fact, in a twisted way, by going to the brothel, the knight was honoring his wife. He was protecting her purity by defiling someone else. This is the justification the moral plumbing will get to. Many knights developed favorite houses where their gold ensured discretion and familiarity. Some even treated the women as confidants, whispering gossip about noble feuds or military campaigns between kisses. He got the illusion of intimacy, without the consequences of it. Next, the new money. Merchants, too, were frequent patrons. Prosperous men from the markets of Les Halles or the docks of the Seine often sought relaxation after counting coins all day. It was full of young men who had come to study theology, law, and medicine. They were poor, they were bored, and they were convinced of their own genius. They would sit in a freezing garret all day debating Aristotle and the nature of God, and at night they went out to conduct field research. They were the loudest, poorest, and most annoying clients. The same institution that condemned brothels also taxed them, inspected them, and quietly ensured their survival. Let's talk about the most direct link: land. Who owned Europe? The Church. The Church was the single largest landowner in Christendom. It owned farms. It owned villages. It owned vast swathes of cities, including Paris. And what do you do when you own land? You rent it out. You are a landlord. Records from the 13th and 14th centuries show that Parisian clergy collected rent from houses of ill repute, often through intermediaries, to maintain plausible deniability. This is the genius of bureaucracy. The Abbey of Saint-Germain doesn't collect rent from a brothel. Heaven forfend. The Abbey collects rent from a respectable citizen, a Mr. Jean Legros. It's about ensuring that the knight, the merchant, and the priest don't get sick. It's quality control. The Church was the FDA of sin. It also regulated their clothing. The law in Paris demanded that prostitutes wear distinctive clothing: a striped hood, a scarlet ribbon. This wasn't just a badge of shame. It was a brand. It was a uniform. It was advertising. The moral justification. Now, you are a 1st century theologian. You are an intellectual. You are not a fool. You see this. You see the hypocrisy. It's as plain as the cross on your chest, and it bothers you. How do you reconcile this? How do you reconcile God's law, which is pure, with the church's business, which is filthy? You don't change the business. It poisons the home. You need the sewer to channel the filth away from the places that matter. And the theologians of Paris seized on this. This was their answer. The logic was delightfully twisted. Church authorities claimed brothels were a lesser evil, a way to prevent greater sins like adultery, rape, and sodomy. See, it's not a sin. It's a solution. Men are weak. Men are animals. The prostitute, therefore, was not a sinner. She was a martyr. She was a sacrifice. She was a guardian. She was the sewer that kept the palace of the virtuous family clean. She was the filthy, unspoken, unthanked pillar of civilization. Thus, the trade of sin became, in the church's eyes, a form of moral plumbing, diverting lust away from the sacred and toward the expendable. The expendable. The exorcist lied that he was fighting Satan, when he was fighting a political opponent with a stage play. And the priest in Paris lied that he was saving souls when he was running a business on the back of their sins. But this last lie, this Parisian lie, this one is different. This one is special. This one is, perhaps, the most honest lie of all. The secret brothel of medieval Paris were never just places of pleasure. The brothel was the mirror you looked into at 3 a.m., the mirror that showed you the sweat, the shame, the animal, the mirror that did not show you the knight, but the man, the mirror that did not show you the priest, but the hypocrite, the mirror that showed you the ape that was always living right behind the angel's face. The real war, the eternal war, the war that matters, was the war inside the city, inside the man. It was the war between the angel and the ape, the war between the sermon and the spine, the war between the soul and the spleen. The angel was an architect, a visionary. The angel looked at the mud of the Ile de la Cité and dreamed of God. But the ape was there too. The ape is not an architect. The ape is a tenant. The ape looked at the cat-taine and he shivered. And the ape said, "That's a beautiful speech. I'm cold, I'm hungry, and I'm lonely." The ape is the horizontal impulse. The ape doesn't care about the soul. The ape is the body. The ape is the appetite, the need, the itch. This is the thesis written in stone and flesh. Stand on that bridge, the Pont au Change. Look left. You see the spires of Notre Dame and Sainte-Chapelle. It is the most profound expression of the vertical impulse in human history. It's the architecture of ambition, the architecture of aspiration. Into the maze of the Rue de la Harpe or a dozen other alleys, you don't see spires. You see a door, a heavy, wooden, unmarked door. You see a shuttered window. You see the horizontal impulse, the architecture of the body, the architecture of the appetite, the architecture of the ape. It's not reaching up to God. It's reaching sideways to another body. Its identity was honesty. It was the only city in the world that was honest about its own hypocrisy. It didn't pretend the ape didn't exist. It didn't shove the ape into an asylum and lie about it. It looked the ape in the face, gave it a name, gave it a street, gave it a uniform, and taxed it. It integrated its sin into its bureaucracy. Their perfectly adapted, integrated systems, born of the environment, for the environment. They belong. The mountain man did not belong. He was, by definition, an intruder. He was half wild, which is, in many ways, the most painful, most lonely thing a man can be. To be half wild means you are caught permanently between two worlds you can no longer inhabit. You have to force your existence upon the landscape. You have to carve out a space with an axe and a rifle. The animals look at you not as a brother, but as a threat, or more likely, as a poorly packaged meal. So you exist in this permanent, agonizing limbo. You are a ghost to the civilized world, a story they tell back east. And you are a monster to the wilderness, a creature of iron and fire that doesn't belong. You are half wild. And where was this landscape? The frozen heart of North America. What a phrase. Not the Wild West, not the frontier. The frozen heart. It implies a center. It implies a place that is not just cold, but is the source of cold. It is the place where the continent's pulse slows to a crawl, one icy beat per minute. Geographically, this was the Rocky Mountains, the upper Missouri, the great empty spaces that were, on maps, simply labeled unexplored. But it's a metaphorical place too. We live our lives inside this bubble of warmth. We have domesticated the seasons. We have put winter in a cage, and we tap on the glass of our double-paned windows, safe and sound, while the storm rages outside. Central heating is a guarantee. You pay a bill, you get warmth. It's a transaction. It's predictable. It's safe. These men lived in a world without any guarantees. Their warmth was not a given. It was not a utility. It was a verb. It was an action. What is a good decision? A good decision is a luxury. It is a product of having options. You make a good decision when you are standing at a crossroads and you have 2 or 3 or 5 safe paths to choose from. You weigh the pros and cons. You consult your feelings. You choose the path that maximizes your potential or sparks joy. This is the talk of a comfortable, centrally heated world. These men did not have options. They did not have safe paths. The city was full of lies. It lied about society. It lied about God. It lied about opportunity. The wilderness told one simple, brutal truth. I will try to kill you every second of every day. If you are strong enough, or smart enough, or just plain lucky enough, you might see sunrise. For them, that brutal honesty was preferable to the soft, suffocating hypocrisy of the civilized world. They didn't have good decisions. They just had decisions. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. This isn't just idle curiosity. This isn't just engagement bait. This is the other half of the miracle, and the other half of the irony. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Fascinating and deeply, deeply ironic. We are about to spend an hour discussing men who are defined by their absolute, crushing solitude. We need it because it makes our own lives, our lives of thermostats and spreadsheets and food that arrives in a box, seem like the civilized choice. We look at the myth and we feel a quiet, smug satisfaction that we have progressed beyond such a hard, simple life. The truth, as it so often is far uglier, far more pathetic, and infinitely more interesting. The men who went west weren't philosophers seeking truth. They weren't proto-environmentalists seeking harmony. They were the men risking their souls to gather the raw materials for a fashion trend they would never see, in a city they would never visit. The job description was simple. Spend 6 months in the mountains, get frostbite, and maybe bring back something worth selling. The average life expectancy was 1 bad campfire away from 0. This was the world they chose. Or, more accurately, the world that was left over after all other options had been exhausted. The indifferent cold, the first thing every mountain man learned, usually the hard way, was that the cold doesn't hate you. It just doesn't care if you live. This is the first and only commandment of their new religion. In the world they left behind, everything had intent. If the crops failed, God was punishing you. If you got sick, the devil was tempting you. If you failed in business, your neighbor had an edge. Humans are meaning-making machines. There is no education like the first night of a high-altitude blizzard. It strips the ego bare. The man who, that morning, was boasting of his grit, and his determination is, by nightfall, a sobbing, shivering child, praying to a God he'd forgotten, his mind reduced to a single, primal, looping thought: I am cold, I am going to die. A veteran trapper could always spot a newcomer by how loudly they cursed the snow. This was the tell. Cursing is a civilized act. Cursing is an act of ego. It is a demand that the universe listen to your displeasure. It's the ultimate expression of a main character who is outraged that the plot isn't going his way. The old hands didn't bother. You only curse what listens. The veteran didn't curse the snow. He listened to it. He read it. He treated it as a sacred text, a deadly scripture. Frostbite wasn't an if. It was a when. This wasn't pessimism. This was logistics. This was planning. The civilized mind thinks of the body as a whole. You become so still, so patient, so cold in your own heart that you achieve a kind of grim, frozen nirvana. You sit, motionless, for 6 hours, checking a trap line. You are not a man. You are a rock. You are a dead stump. You have blurred the line between the observer and the observed. You have become so attuned to the white silence that you are now part of it, because the truth the mountain lived by is still the simplest. The cold doesn't care. It just waits. It is attentive. It is the sound of a predator that has just stopped moving to listen for you. The mountain men learned that quickly. You didn't just hear the cold. You read it. You read it in the quality of the silence. The way your breath hung in the air told you how close death was feeling that day. Did it plume? Did it crystallize and fall? Did it hang in front of your face like a ghost, refusing to dissipate? Each one was a word, a sentence, a paragraph in the daily weather report. If it squeaked underfoot, the cold was serious. Why? Because the individual ice crystals were frozen so hard, so dry, that they were like tiny, sharp pieces of glass, shattering under your boot. That squeak was the sound of no moisture, the sound of -30, the sound of danger. If it crunched, it was survivable. Crunch meant moisture. Crunch meant the crystals were wetter, stickier. It meant it was warmer, maybe only 10 degrees below freezing. That was a nice day. The armor of insulation. To survive the mountains, you didn't need bravery. You needed insulation, both physical and mental. Bravery is another civilized word. Bravery is what you have when you have options. Bravery is choosing the dangerous path over the safe one. As we've established, these men had no safe paths. Therefore, bravery was irrelevant. Insulation, however, insulation was everything. It was the barrier. It was the wall. It was the only thing that separated you, the 98. Then a vest, a coat, and an outer layer of fur so thick it could have legally voted as another person. Beaver, bear, buffalo. Whatever you had killed, you wrapped yourself in the skin of an animal that was better at this than you were, hoping to trick the cold. By the end of winter, most of them looked like furniture that had learned to walk. They weren't men. They were mounds. They were shambling, stinking, walking collections of dead animals. Others opened trading posts and spent their final winters selling overpriced coffee to people who called it adventure. The irony, the cynicism, the man who had eaten his boots, now selling coffee to a tourist who was adventuring. It was the end of the world. A few just wandered deeper into the mountains and didn't come back, which frankly was the most poetic option available. They didn't retire. They disappeared. They walked into winter one last time. But we're not going to our civilization. We're not going to the world of stainless steel and gentle blue gas flames and refrigerators that obediently keep our food in a state of suspended animation. No, we are going to a different kind of wilderness. A wilderness of smoke and soot and superstition. a wilderness of profound, grinding, structural inequality. We are trading the indifferent cold for a very interested hierarchy. Step into a medieval kitchen. They just knew that it worked. And when you don't know the why, you fill in the gap with superstition. The hearth was a place where survival met superstition. Housewives stirred pottage with one hand and crossed themselves with the other, whispering that the pot must turn clockwise or the devil would spoil the meal. This wasn't a joke. This was quality control. This was cosmic insurance. You failed to make the sign of the cross? The pottage boiled over? That wasn't a mistake. Because in this world, there were two entirely separate, parallel universes. There was the world of the peasant, and there was the world of the noble. And the kitchen was the place that defined, more clearly than any law or castle wall, the unbridgeable, infinite gulf between them. The peasant's pot, for the vast, vast majority of people, the 90% of humanity that didn't have a sir or a lord in front of their name, the kitchen was not about art. It was about not dying. For peasants, ingredients came from the soil, sometimes grudgingly. The menu was not a choice. The menu was whatever you didn't starve to death on last winter. Barley, rye, and oats were staples. And what did you do with them? You boiled them into pottage thick enough to stand a spoon upright. The guts were sausage casings. The fat was lard, which you would treasure for months, adding a teaspoon of it to the pottage on special days. The meat was salted and smoked and cured to make it last until Easter. The idea of roasting a fresh ham, that was not just wasteful. It was a sin. It was gluttony. It was an insult to God and to the pig. This was the peasant's pot. It was a gray, monotonous world. It was a world of survival. The noble's theater, if the peasant's pot was about survival. For the wealthy, however, the kitchen was a theater of excess. It was not about food. It was about power. It was not about calories. It was about waste. It was not about eating. It was about watching. Noble households demanded spectacle, and food was the stage. The point of a feast was not to feed people. They were already fed. The point was to astound them. The point was to humiliate them with your wealth. The animals lived far away. It took time for the dead cow to get to the castle, and time plus damp warmth equals rot. The meat was always on the turn. It was always a little bit off. It had that tang of decay. So, what do? You can't serve rotten meat. Yes, you can. Spices could mask the tang of decay, turning questionable cuts into aromatic delicacies. You don't add a pinch of cloves. You add a pound of cloves. You add cinnamon. You add sugar. It wasn't our science of germs and calories and vitamins. It was their science. Cooks were guided by the theory of the humors. This was the medical dogma of the age. It came from the Greeks, so it had to be right. The body and the universe was made of 4 liquids: humors, uxie, blood, hot, moist, sanguine, cheerful, 2, flame, cold and moist, phlegmatic, calm, 3, yellow bile, hot and dry, choleric, angry. Sid, it has nothing to do with taste. It has everything to do with saving the Lord's soul and body. Food wasn't just about taste. It was about keeping your health and your soul in harmony. If your Lord was angry, choleric, he had too much yellow bile, hot and dry. You, the cook, must serve him cold and moist food. You serve him lettuce, cucumbers, fish. You must not serve him pepper or wine. That would be pouring hot on hot. It would be malpractice. On one hand, there were the endless banquets of kings and lords, tables groaning under the weight of roasted boar, almond tarts, and goblets of spiced wine. This was the feast day. On the other, There were the lean years when peasants scraped by on watery pottage and stale bread, praying that next year's harvest wouldn't betray them. This was also famine. But there was another famine. In the medieval world, eating wasn't simply about appetite. It forced people to not eat their tractors, cows, and egg machines, chickens. It was a centrally planned economic system of food rationing. But for cooks, these restrictions were both a nightmare and a creative challenge. The peasant cook? No challenge for her. She was already fasting. Her pottage didn't have meat, eggs, or butter in it anyway. Oh, it's Lent? So I eat my gray sludge. Just sadder? For the peasant, Lent was Tuesday. You could eat roast goose during Lent, as long as it was a barnacle goose. This was theological cheating. Religion didn't only shape what was forbidden, it blessed what was allowed. Feast days unleashed abundance. Roasted oxen, honeyed breads, and rivers of ale marked holy celebrations. This was the other side of the coin. On this day, to not eat meat was the sin. To be frugal was to be ungrateful to God for his bounty. In the heart of 17th century France, in this world of absolute spiritual warfare, nestled between the Loire River and fields of wheat, lay the quiet town of Loudun, a place that should have been utterly forgettable. It was nowhere. It was everyone's hometown. Its streets were narrow and cobbled, its churches modest, and its people pious in the way small towns are when the world around them feels uncertain. And the world was profoundly uncertain. A priest had turned into a phantom, a convent had turned into a theater, and Loudun, already ripe with tension, was about to explode. They spoke in strange voices, usually a deeper register, a growl, cursed in Latin they were never taught. This is the classic trope, and it's always a lie. They were nuns. They heard Latin every single day. It was the muzak of their lives. They weren't reciting Virgil. They were shouting garbled fragments of the Mass, backwards, which is the only trick you need. It was the reed, 17:3. Only safe language. She had to describe the urges and terrors of a body she had been taught to hate. Some rolled on the floor in fits of agony. Others screamed Grandier's name as though he were both their tormentor and their savior. And that is the truth. He was. They clawed at the altar, levitated in fits, or, more likely, jumped and thrashed so violently that it looked like levitation, and shouted obscenities that would make sailors blush. This was the best part. This was the only time in their lives these women would ever be allowed to swear. The only time they could be vulgar, sexual, and loud. Of course they took the opportunity. Word of the possessed Ursulines spread beyond Loudun's borders, drawing priests, doctors, and the merely curious. Exorcists arrived by the dozen, armed with relics and holy water, eager to battle Satan himself, and even more eager to make a name for themselves. This was a career opportunity. Some fainted dramatically. Others claimed to see Grandier's face in the shadows. The church, sensing both danger and opportunity, began to investigate in earnest. This was out of control. This could make the church look foolish. Or, if managed correctly, it could be a powerful tool. If the devil had chosen Loudun, then France needed a victory and a scapegoat. Father Lakens and Father Trinil led the rituals with theatrical flair, shouting commands at invisible spirits and interrogating the nuns as though conducting a courtroom drama. This was the script. The exorcist would hold up a crucifix. The nun, Jeanne, would shriek and convulse. The exorcist would shout in Latin, "Who are you?" The nun, in a deep voice, would say, "I am Astaroth." Only Satan is that proud. His one act of sanity was used as the final proof of his guilt. They still needed one thing, a confession. A trial is good, a confession is better. It makes the paperwork clean. So, they tortured him. He was tortured for days to extract a confession. his legs crushed between wooden boards, the boot, as priests demanded repentance. They shattered his legs, but according to some accounts, he died screaming a few weeks later, as if cursed by the very act. A footnote that history enjoys. The crowd watched as the priest's robes caught fire, smoke curling into the sky like incense. Some said they saw a white dove escape from the flames, the soul of Grandier ascending. Others said the smoke formed the shape of a mocking grin. The crowd always sees what it wants to see. The nuns' fits continued sporadically, even after Grandier's death, their supposed deliverance proving as elusive as their demons. The show must go on. Jeanne des Anges and her troupe. They had discovered fame. They had discovered power. It turned out they didn't need Grandier to be possessed. They were possessed by the attention. They were addicted to the drama. Outside of Loudun, whispers began to spread. The air is thick with the smell of cold stone, melting beeswax, and incense, the holy perfume of salvation. And then you walk 50 paces. You cross a bridge, the Pont Neuf, or one of its rickety ancestors. You leave the island of God and you step into the left bank. You step into the maze of the university quarter, and the smell changes. The incense fades to be damaged goods. No man will marry you. No convent will take you. You are an outcast. Others were widows or wives abandoned by soldiers who never returned. For many, the brothel was less a moral fall than an act of survival. It was a lateral move. It's not that they fell from grace. It's that they were never given it in the first place. They were just trying to eat. He talks about the political maneuver. He talks about his rival. And the woman lying there, invisible, a tool. She listens. And she tells the madam. And the madam remembers. Some used this knowledge as protection. Others as quiet revenge. This knowledge was their bank account. It was their insurance. In a way, they held a power most virtuous women could never imagine. The power of knowing men as they truly were. A parade of sinners, united by desire. The brothel was the great equalizer. It was the only true democracy in France. In the great hall of the king, hierarchy was everything. In the cathedral, hierarchy was everything. In the brothel, your title didn't matter. Your bloodline didn't matter. Your coin mattered. It was a pure, brutal, capitalist meritocracy. Lust was a mortal sin. It was a straight ticket to damnation. Unofficially, it managed the traffic. This is the great secret. The church was the godfather. It was the ultimate protection racket. It created the sin, then it sold the absolution, and in the middle, it took a cut of the sin itself. The bishop's office, meanwhile, ensured the women were registered and examined for cleanliness. This sounds enlightened, doesn't it? It sounds like public health. It wasn't. Not out of compassion, but to maintain public order and prevent disease outbreaks among wealthy clients. It's not about protecting the woman. It's about protecting the product. Its sermons damned lust, yet its ledgers depended on it, and no one dared call it blasphemy, because everyone was profiting. What else were they? They were sewers. This was the official justification, the moral plumbing. And it was true. We, in our modern world, think we are past this. We think this is barbaric. But we have our own sewers. We have our own moral plumbing. We just call it the internet. She knew the bishop's vices. She knew the knight's debts. She knew the merchant's fears. She knew everything. The secrets whispered into the pillows of her house. That was her vault. That was her capital. It was the insurance that kept the city guard from bashing down her door. It was the leverage that allowed her to negotiate with the priest's accountant. No, they were never just places of pleasure. That was the least interesting thing about them. They were reflections of a society at war with itself. This was the war, not France versus England, not the king versus the barons. Those were just border disputes, just arguments over who got to collect the taxes. And so, while the angel was building his cathedral, the ape was building his tavern. And while the angel was carving a gargoyle, the ape was renting the upstairs room. The society was at war with itself because it was a society of humans. And a human is a war. A human is a contradiction. A human is a civil war in a bag of skin. And the only way to survive that war is to make peace with the fact that you will never ever win. You can only manage the conflict. Paris was conflict management as an art form. And so, we leave it there. The city of light. The light of the cathedral's window. And the light of the brothel's candle. They are the same light. They are the same city.